Hey everyone, welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. This time we're bundling up in our woefully inadequate woolens and clutching our probably splintering oars as we venture into the charming world of the Viking Longship trader. Prepare to discover exactly why navigating icy seas, dodging mythical beasts, and dealing with the constant threat of actual axe-wielding maniacs made their lives profoundly and damply suck. You've seen them in countless sagas, blockbuster movies, and perhaps even some suspiciously well-groomed reenactors at your local medieval fair. The noble Viking, master of the seas, eyes fixed on distant shores, beard flowing majestically in the salty breeze, as his magnificent longship cuts effortlessly through the waves. He's the epitome of rugged adventure, a fearless explorer, a cunning trader, maybe even a part-time poet, when he's not busy discovering new lands or engaging in robust, if somewhat violent, cultural exchange. He's the poster boy for a bygone era of daring and discovery, a man whose breakfast probably consisted of lightning bolts and the tears of his enemies, all before a bracing morning raid. But let's haul that romantic longship into the dry dock of reality for a moment, scrape off the barnacles of heroic fantasy, and take a good, long sniff of the bilge water, which probably smells strongly of stale fish, unwashed Vikings, and existential dread. Trust me, being an actual Viking longship trader, particularly one trying to scrape a precarious living on the notoriously moody and monster-filled waters between Norway, Iceland, and the perpetually damp and often hostile British Isles, was nothing like those inspiring tapestries or testosterone-fueled epics. It wasn't about glorious conquest every Tuesday. More often, it was cold, it was wet, it was terrifyingly uncertain, and it was punctuated by mind-numbing boredom, back-breaking labor, and the constant nagging suspicion that the next wave, the next fog bank, the next ominous bubbling from the deep, or the next boatload of unfriendly strangers with pointier axes than yours might be your last. For most who lived it, it was a life of relentless, slogging hardship, a gamble against a stacked deck where the house, the North Atlantic mostly, always had the advantage. It profoundly, unequivocally, and often very, very damply sucked. So, if you're ready to trade your horned helmet, which, by the way, was mostly a flight of fancy for actual Viking warriors, but let's not shatter all the aesthetically pleasing illusions at once. For a good dose of historical misery, do take a moment to like this video, subscribe to The Weary Wanderer, and perhaps even clang your digital drinking horns in the comments below. Let me know if you've ever pondered the less glamorous side of Viking voyages, the sheer logistical nightmare of it all, or if there's another poor historical soul whose suffering you'd like us to explore in future. Your support helps us keep dredging these uncomfortable truths from the depths of the past, much like our Viking might dredge up a particularly unappetizing bit of seaweed for dinner. Now, perhaps find a comfortable spot, maybe one with a roof, solid, unmoving floorboards, and blessedly dry socks, luxuries our Viking trader could only dream of during long, pitching weeks at sea. Close your eyes if you dare, though our trader probably wouldn't recommend it for long, lest a rogue wave, an over-inquisitive seagull, or a crewmate mistaking your face for a footrest disturb your reverie. Prepare to drift with us into the gray, chilling expanse of the North Atlantic, into a world of profound superstition, relentless sweat, and the ever-present scent of wet wool, stale fish, and low-grade panic. Let's step aboard his longship, try to find a space amongst the damp cargo and even damper crewmates, and try not to capsize under the sheer weight of historical awfulness we're about to unpack. So, how does one become a Viking longship trader? A purveyor of goods across some of the most inhospitable waters known to pre-medieval man. A man whose business card, had such things existed, might have read specialist in acquiring frostbite and narrowly avoiding sea monsters, inquire within, if you dare. Did our budding entrepreneur wake up one bright, frosty morning, flush with ambition after a particularly inspiring dream of bartering walrus ivory for slightly less damp wool, and declare, "Yes, this challenging, often lethal, and incredibly uncomfortable life is the one for me"? Unlikely. Oh, profoundly, cosmically unlikely. You weren't so much born as you were gradually marinated in the brine of your destiny, steeped in the traditions of the sea like a forgotten teabag in a cold cup. For most, this wasn't a career choice made with a clear head and a pros and cons list. It was an inheritance, as unavoidable as the changing of the brutally short Scandinavian seasons, or the suspicious green tinge that inevitably appeared on week-old salted herring. No silver spoon, or even a reasonably polished wooden one, awaited you in the cradle. No sprawling, sun-drenched estates with peacefully grazing sheep were part of your birthright, unless those sheep were destined to become cargo, of course, in which case their peace was regrettably temporary. Instead, your primary inheritance was likely the family's fractional share in a clinker-built longship, a vessel probably already older than your grandfather, smelling faintly and permanently of fish guts, wet dog, old rope, and generations of accumulated seasickness. Your earliest lullabies weren't soothing melodies about pastoral idols. They were the rhythmic creak of timbers straining against a stubborn swell, the percussive groan of oars in their locks during windless slogs, and the distant, mournful howl of the wind as it tried to peel the turf roof from your family's longhouse. The ever-present, inescapable scent of salt, damp wood, curing hides, and the sharp tang of tar was practically woven into your swaddling clothes. A fragrant, if somewhat alarming overture to a life of maritime drudgery. You were funneled into the noble, if profoundly uncomfortable lineage of longship traders, with all the gentle inevitability of water finding its own level, usually a very cold, very choppy, and very unwelcoming one. The sea was not just in your backyard. It was in your blood, your future, and probably on rough days your lungs. Your formal education in this esteemed profession began roughly around the time you could walk without immediately face-planting on a slippery, seaweed-strewn rock. Forget the leisurely pursuit of learning your runes or memorizing heroic sagas in the relative comfort of a warm, dry room. Your classroom was the wind-lashed jetty. Your textbooks were calloused hands and aching backs, and your primary teaching aids were the indifferent elements. From the moment you could lift a piece of driftwood heavier than your own head without toppling over like a freshly felled sapling, you were put to work. By age 7, you weren't just a child in the eyes of the world. You were cheap, occasionally clumsy, but undeniably expendable labor, a tiny shivering apprentice in the grand ancient guild of commercial suffering. Your toys? Oh, the enchanting, character-building playthings of a young Viking trader in training. Perhaps a fascinating collection of unusually shaped pebbles, ideal for skipping across the icy water or, more practically, for weighting down a fishing net. Maybe you cherished a length of frayed rope, perfect for practicing the intricate knots that might one day be the only thing between you and an unscheduled reunion with your ancestors in the watery halls of Ran. Or perhaps you brandished a splintered piece of an old oar, excellent for imaginary sword fights that mostly ended with real tears, another impressive splinter, and a stern glare from someone larger and significantly less amused. Your playground? The glorious, ever-changing shoreline, a delightful natural obstacle course composed of sharp, ankle-twisting rocks, patches of treacherous sucking mud, and the occasional decomposing sea creature radiating an aroma of profound existential disappointment. Or, for a change of scenery, the bustling, chaotic wharf, where you could learn valuable life lessons such as how to avoid being crushed by a rolling barrel of ale and the precise moment a disgruntled, heavily armed sailor is about to throw something heavy in your general direction. While other children in, shall we say, less maritime-focused and more sensible inland communities might have been learning to track deer, tend crops, or perhaps even, Odin and Freya forbid, engage in frivolous, unproductive play, you were mastering the grim but essential skills of your future, waterlogged trade. You learned how to caulk seams and patch a leaky boat hull with nothing but sticky, foul-smelling tar, a good deal of desperation, and a few surprisingly foul curses you diligently picked up from listening to your elders. You learned to distinguish the particular scent of an approaching storm from the equally pungent, yet subtly different smell of your uncle's favorite socks drying by the communal fire. You learned, through repeated, unpleasant experience, that the sea was a profoundly fickle mistress, capable of cradling your vessel gently one moment and then attempting to smash it into 1,000 pieces the next, often with very little discernible warning or rationale. Fun games of your youth likely included fetch the dropped rivet before father delivers a motivational speech with his belt, a thrilling escapade usually played barefoot on freezing, splinter-strewn mud. Another classic was don't let the goats eat the new sail, a strategic challenge requiring cunning, agility, and a depressing willingness to smell faintly of goat for the remainder of the day. And of course, you became intimately, painfully familiar with the ancient art of bailing. Oh, the endless, rhythmic, soul-destroying scooping of icy water from a vessel that seemed to consider leaking a fundamental, unchangeable part of its core identity, a defining personality trait even. Your primary instructor in this open-air, frequently sub-zero, and perpetually damp school of hard knocks was likely your father, or perhaps a grizzled uncle, whose own seafaring days had left him looking less like a man and more like a piece of ancient weathered driftwood that had been roughly carved into the approximate shape of a human being and then left out in the rain for several decades. His face was a veritable roadmap of past voyages, intricately etched with the fine calligraphy of salt gale wrinkles around the eyes, the occasional faded scar from a misunderstanding in a foreign port regarding the quality of his goods or the parentage of a local chieftain, and a nose that had clearly lost a decisive argument or two with either a fist, an errant boom, or perhaps an overly aggressive seabird. His vocabulary was as sparse and functional as a winter tree, consisting mainly of monosyllabic grunts, sharp, decisive nods, the occasional barked command that could startle seals at 50 paces, and a sigh that seemed to carry the accumulated weight of all the oceans he'd ever crossed and all the disappointing trade deals he'd ever brokered. Eloquence, he knew, was for scalds, court poets, and people who didn't have to worry about their boat suddenly deciding to explore the seabed. He taught you everything you needed to know, not through patient explanation, encouraging words, or, God forbid, positive reinforcement, but through a rigorous curriculum of harsh, first-hand experience and implied, occasionally explicit, threats. A misplaced coil of rope, left untidy on the deck, might earn you a stinging cuff to the side of the ear, accompanied by a glare that promised worse if the offense was repeated. A moment of inattention while at the steering oar, allowing the ship to yaw even slightly off course, could result in you being unceremoniously shoved aside, with a guttural growl that suggested you were personally conspiring with Loki, the god of mischief, to send you all to a cold, watery grave. Forget gentle encouragement or constructive criticism. His pedagogical method was more akin to, do it right this instant, or I'll feed you to the krakens, and frankly, they might complain about the taste. Essential life lessons, like how to swim, probably involved being unceremoniously tossed into the near-freezing waters of the fjord with the helpful, if somewhat stark, advice, sink or don't. Your choice, boy. Important nautical knots, the kind that held fast under tons of strain from a wind-filled sail, were learned by having your fumbling failures pointed out with a withering glare that could curdle milk at 20 paces, followed by the curt demand to do it again, and again, and again, until your fingers were raw, your knuckles were bleeding, and your brain was numb with cold and frustration. Yet amidst this tapestry of unrelenting gruffness and the constant low hum of imminent peril, there might have been, if you squinted very hard and used your imagination, microscopic glimmers of what could, in a very dim light, and with a generous interpretation, be interpreted as brutal pragmatism, or even a twisted, almost unrecognizable form of kindness. Perhaps after you successfully navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of coastline, threading the needle between jagged, ship-eating rocks without once scraping the precious hull, again, he might emit a grunt that was marginally less disapproving than his usual repertoire of unhappy noises. Maybe, just maybe, on a truly bitter, ice-encrusted night, huddled miserably under a damp sail for warmth, he'd wordlessly pass you a slightly larger, slightly less weevil-infested piece of hardtack, a gesture that in this bleak context screamed volumes of paternal affection, or at least a grudging acknowledgement that you hadn't yet died of incompetence. These weren't tender, heartwarming moments, you understand. They were more like the brief, surprised respite a condemned man feels when the executioner's axe is momentarily paused for sharpening. He wasn't meticulously teaching you a trade out of benevolent concern for your future prosperity. He was brutally forging you into a tool, a functional component of the family business, one hopefully less prone to breaking or complaining than the last one. Holidays? Weekends off with full pay and benefits? Paid sick leave? Perhaps accompanied by a sympathetic note from a local rune reader and a warm cup of something that wasn't predominantly seawater? Adorable concepts, truly. But for our Viking longship trader, such civilized niceties were about as common as a kraken politely asking for directions before refraining from eating your ship. The North Atlantic didn't punch a time clock, the currents didn't observe the Sabbath, and the relentless demands of maintaining a leaky wooden boat laden with valuable, or sometimes just incredibly smelly and questionably sourced, cargo certainly didn't pause for any saints' days, except perhaps for those of particularly malevolent sea deities who seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from their ongoing torment. The toil wasn't just a daily occurrence. It was an omnipresent, fundamental condition of existence, as unavoidable as the dampness that clung to every fiber of their being, or the subtle, ever-present fear of impending, probably very wet, doom. A typical day, if such a predictable entity could even be said to exist in a life so utterly dictated by the capricious whims of wind, wave, and the occasional grumpy sea god, began not with the gentle kiss of dawn upon a peacefully sleeping brow. More likely, it commenced with the percussive rhythm of icy spray hitting the side of the hull like Odin's own war drum being played by an over-enthusiastic troll, or perhaps the gentle, insistent nudge of a fellow crewmate's calloused, probably unwashed, boot to your ribs, signaling it was your turn for some godforsaken task at an hour most sensible land dwellers would still consider the dead of night. Sunrise, when visible through the perpetual gray, was an event our trader often witnessed from a position of extreme discomfort, clinging to a yardarm, bailing icy water, or straining at an oar, already hours into his thankless labors. Breakfast, assuming the lurching of the ship and the state of one's stomach permitted such an indulgence, was a hasty, joyless affair. It might involve gnawing on a piece of hardtack so dense it could have been used to ballast the ship, perhaps softened slightly by a daring dunk into some brackish, vaguely sloshing water, or, if the ship's stores were feeling particularly generous, a mouthful of weak, sour ale that did precious little to warm the endemic chill in your bones. More often than not, sustenance was a case of eat when you can, what you can, if you can keep it down, and try not to think too hard about what it actually is. Then it was straight back to the multifaceted symphony of maritime suffering. If the wind was favorable, a rare and deeply suspicious gift from the gods, often viewed as a trick, it meant hours spent wrestling with the heavy, unwieldy square sail, this monstrous sheet of coarse wool or linen, perpetually damp and smelling faintly of mildew and desperation, seemed to possess a malevolent mind of its own. This involved hauling on stiff, salt-encrusted ropes until your palms were raw and bleeding, adjusting the massive wooden yard that felt heavier than a dead ox, and constantly trimming the sail to catch every fickle, teasing gust, all while the ship bucked, rolled, and pitched like a drunken whale in a hurricane. Teamwork was essential, though it usually manifested as a series of guttural grunts, barked commands, and desperate synchronized heaves, everyone acutely aware that a snapped rope, a splintered spar, or a poorly managed sail in a sudden squall could mean immediate disaster, or at the very least, a lot of frantic shouting, even more work, and the skipper looking at you with that special expression that suggested he was mentally calculating how much your hide would fetch at the next port. If the wind died, as it so often did, or worse, blew stubbornly and insolently from the exact direction you desperately needed to go. A favorite meteorological prank, presumably orchestrated by Loki himself. Then out came the oars. Oh, the dreaded oars. These weren't elegant, lightweight sculls for a leisurely river outing. These were long, heavy, brutally functional lengths of timber, each one feeling as if it had been carved from a petrified oak tree and then thoughtfully weighted with several large rocks for good measure. Rowing a Viking longship in the open ocean wasn't a picturesque display of synchronized movement. It was a brutal, mind-numbing, back-breaking, soul-crushing marathon of agony. For hours, sometimes for days on end, if the calm persisted, or the headwinds were particularly spiteful, you and your equally miserable shipmates would strain against the relentless, indifferent drag of the sea. Your muscles would scream in protest, your joints would grind, your breath would rasp in the frigid, salt-laden air. The rhythm was hypnotic in its pure, unadulterated awfulness. Dip, pull, strain, lift, feather, repeat. Dip, pull, strain, lift, feather, repeat. Ad infinitum, ad nauseum, until your vision blurred. Your hands were bloody stumps, and the entire world narrowed to the sweating, lice-ridden back of the man in front of you, and the agonizing, fiery burn in your shoulders, back, and thighs. There were no ergonomically designed rowing seats, no polite requests for a 5-minute water break, no encouraging words from a coxswain. You rowed until you were told to stop, or until you physically collapsed, at which point you'd likely be revived with a bucket of seawater to the face and the gentle encouragement of a rope's end, all while being subjected to the silent scorn or vocal derision of your hardier, or perhaps just temporarily less exhausted, crewmates. And the joyous work didn't magically cease when you finally, miraculously, against all odds and expectations, made landfall at some dreary, windswept port or beached on some inhospitable shore. Oh no, that simply signaled a transition to a different, equally exhausting kind of toil. Now it was time to unload the precious cargo. Barrels of pickled fish that smelled like a forgotten battlefield, bundles of itchy furs still faintly redolent of their previous owners, sacks of surprisingly heavy grain, blocks of easily chipped soapstone, or perhaps live, and usually very unhappy, seasick, and vocal, livestock. This involved manhandling every single item from the cramped, dark, and phenomenally smelly confines of the ship's hold, often wading through freezing, waist-deep surf, and then hauling it up some slippery beach or onto a rickety, swaying dock. Then, of course, once the ship was emptied of its outbound misery, you'd have the distinct pleasure of loading the new cargo for the return journey or the next leg of your exciting voyage, which was invariably just as heavy, just as awkward, just as likely to try and crush your foot or strain your already protesting back. All this frenetic activity would take place under the watchful and usually deeply critical eye of the skipper or the merchant whose goods you were transporting, individuals not generally known for their patience, their generous distribution of encouraging compliments, or their willingness to overlook a single dented pot or damp bale of wool. Your reward for this Herculean effort? The chance to do it all again, but in reverse. The North Atlantic itself wasn't so much a majestic, life-giving body of water as it was a vast, indifferent, and frequently malevolent entity, seemingly possessed of a particularly nasty personality disorder and a deep-seated personal grudge against small wooden boats and the unfortunate souls who sailed them. It didn't just passively host your journey, it actively, aggressively participated, usually in the role of the primary antagonist in your daily, desperate struggle for survival. This wasn't a serene, painted backdrop for heroic deeds. It was a living, breathing, and often furiously screaming character in your miserable, waterlogged drama. The sun, in these high northern latitudes, was a fickle, unreliable, and often downright unhelpful deity. For long, soul-destroying stretches of any given voyage, especially during the gloomy twilight of winter journeys or when the ship was shrouded in perpetual clammy cloud cover, it was little more than a distant, pale rumor in the sky, offering neither tangible warmth nor reliable navigational guidance. When it did bother to show its face, it often did so with a glaring, pitiless, accusatory intensity that reflected cruelly off the endless waves, searing your already strained eyes and baking any exposed skin, while doing absolutely nothing to alleviate the bone-chilling, penetrating damp that had seeped into your very marrow. It was less a life-giving orb of celestial comfort and more a cosmic interrogator, occasionally serving only to highlight just how incredibly vast and terrifyingly empty the ocean was, and how very, very small, insignificant, and eminently losable you and your little boat were within it. And the wind. Oh, the glorious, poetic, saga-inspiring wind. In stark reality, for the Viking trader, it was a capricious, malicious tormentor, a shape-shifting fiend sent by laughing gods. One moment it might be a howling, invisible demon, shrieking through the rigging like 1,000 tortured spirits, whipping the surface of the sea into a terrifying frenzy of towering, spume-crested waves that looked eager to swallow your vessel whole. It would tear at your sail with icy, spectral claws and drive freezing, needle-sharp spray into your face with the force of a sandblaster. The next, it might vanish entirely, with a theatrical sigh, leaving you becalmed and bobbing uselessly in a heavy, greasy, rolling swell, forced to take to the accursed, soul-destroying oars, under a vast, oppressive, leaden sky. The ensuing silence, broken only by the rhythmic groan of timbers, the splash of oars, and the weary curses of your fellow sufferers, was almost as unnerving as the storm's fury. The wind was never just a gentle breeze. It was either a full-blown, terrifying assault or a contemptuous, frustrating abandonment. It whispered insidious threats in the rigging, shrieked like a banshee before a storm, or worse, offered a seductive but ultimately false promise of a swift, easy passage, only to betray you cruelly when you were furthest from the comforting sight of land and most vulnerable. The waves were the wind's shock troops, an endless, relentless gray-green army marching remorselessly upon your fragile wooden citadel. They didn't just carry you, they battered, slapped, and manhandled you. Each one was a liquid fist, sometimes playful, sometimes furious, slamming into the hull with a force that sent jarring shudders through the ship's entire structure. They would climb aboard uninvited, like unwelcome, aggressive guests, dumping tons of frigid, unwelcome water onto the already swamped deck, soaking everything and everyone anew, making the simple act of standing upright a perilous, exhausting balancing act. Sleep, when it was even possible, was often punctuated by a rogue wave deciding to use your sleeping face as a convenient splashdown zone, a uniquely unpleasant alarm clock. The ship itself would groan, twist, and protest under this constant, wearying assault, its wooden planks flexing and creaking with an elasticity that was both remarkable and deeply unnerving, a constant, audible reminder of the shockingly thin barrier of wood and tar that separated you from the crushing, indifferent, and very, very cold deep. Then there was the fog. Not a gentle, picturesque mist, but a thick, opaque, disorienting shroud that could descend with terrifying, almost supernatural speed, swallowing the entire world and reducing visibility to a few precarious feet beyond the bow. In the clinging embrace of the fog, all sense of direction could be lost in moments. Familiar landmarks vanished as if they'd never existed. The sun became a forgotten memory, a myth from a warmer, brighter world. Dangers. Jagged, unseen rocks waiting to rip the guts out of your ship. Treacherous shoals lurking just beneath the surface. Other ships, friendly or otherwise, lurked unseen and unheard, their presence only hinted at by the muffled, distorted sound of breaking waves from an unknown direction, or a sudden chilling cry from a lookout who thought he saw something, or someone. And of course, it was in these clinging, sightless banks of gray, impenetrable murk that the mind, already strained by exhaustion and fear, would begin to populate the unseen waters with the half-believed horrors of legend. The sinuous, glistening coils of Jormungandr, the world serpent, big enough to encircle the globe, or the vast, shadowy, tentacled bulk of the kraken, stirring malevolently in the sunless depths, its ancient, malevolent gaze perhaps fixed upon your tiny, insignificant vessel. And let's not forget the particular joy of ice, for those voyages pushing further north towards the forbidding shores of Iceland, or the even more distant and less hospitable coast of Greenland, or even encountered during unusually harsh winters closer to the British Isles. Ice was a silent, creeping, insidious menace. Not just the majestic, if undeniably terrifying icebergs, floating mountains of ancient frost that could calve without warning or roll unexpectedly, but also the treacherous sea ice, the growlers and bergy bits that could punch a hole in a wooden hull with surprising ease. It would freeze the rigging solid, coating the oars and deck with a treacherous, glass-like slickness, and threatening to crush the hull of the unwary or unlucky ship caught in its grip. It was yet another layer of penetrating cold, another dimension of ever-present danger in a world already spectacularly saturated with both. Beyond the grand, terrifying theater of storms and the relentless, monotonous grind of physical labor, the Viking trader's daily existence was a masterclass in enduring a constant, deeply unpleasant sensory assault. Forget any romantic notions of the crisp, invigorating tang of sea air often rhapsodized about in adventure novels. This was a full immersion experience, a baptism by brine, into the less marketable, decidedly less fragrant aspects of historical maritime life. Your ears were never, ever truly at peace, unless perhaps you were lucky enough to be knocked unconscious for a brief spell. The Longship itself was a constant source of noise, a vast, creaking, groaning wooden orchestra playing an unending symphony of complaint and protest. Timbers groaned and shrieked under the strain of wind and wave like the tortured souls of sailors past. The mast, a single massive tree trunk, creaked with every roll of the ship, a sound that always seemed to be the immediate prelude to catastrophic structural failure. The rigging, ropes of walrus or seal hide, or perhaps coarse hemp, hummed and vibrated in the wind with a high, keening, mournful whine, or slapped incessantly and maddeningly against the mast and sail in a calm. When under oar, the rhythmic thud and splash of the blades entering the water, the scrape and clunk of wood against wood in the oar ports, the strained grunts, gasps, and muttered curses of the rowers formed a percussive, almost ritualistic backdrop of pure, unadulterated exertion. Then, there were the ever-present voices of the elements, the terrifying freight train roar of a full gale, the deafening explosive crash of a large wave breaking unexpectedly over the bow or stern, the relentless, insidious hissing of wind-driven spray. In a proper storm, conversation was impossible, reduced to desperate, shouted commands, often misheard or swallowed by the overwhelming din. Even in what passed for calmer weather, the constant, gentle lapping of water against the hull could become a maddening, repetitive torment during long, sleepless, anxious nights. If you were unlucky enough to be transporting livestock, sheep, goats, perhaps even a few very unhappy pigs, their miserable bleating, pathetic squawking, or indignant grunting would add another discordant layer to the cacophony, a chorus of animal misery to accompany, and perhaps even mock your own. The sudden, sharp, gunshot-like crack of ice forming on the rigging or deck planks on a truly frigid night, or the hideous, grating, screeching protest of the hull scraping against an unseen encroaching ice floe, were sounds that could freeze the blood in your veins as effectively as the ambient temperature itself. And in the disorienting embrace of the fog, the unsettling muffled quiet, broken only by the rhythmic drip of condensation from the rigging and the anxious, heavy thumping of your own heart against your ribs, was perhaps the most terrifying sound of all. A silence pregnant with unseen, unimaginable threats. Your skin was a perpetual battleground, a martyr to the elements and the job. The most pervasive sensation, the one that defined your existence more than any other, was dampness, a deep, clinging, inescapable, soul-chilling dampness that seeped into your clothes, your bedding, such as it was, usually a pile of damp straw or your own damp cloak, and seemingly into your very bones and spirit. Nothing ever truly dried. Coupled with this, inevitably, was the cold. Not a brisk, invigorating chill, but a gnawing, persistent, deep-seated cold that no amount of rough-spun, greasy wool could entirely banish, especially when that wool was itself saturated with icy seawater. Your hands were a testament to your trade, perpetually raw, split, chapped, and blistered from the constant friction of rough ropes and oar handles, the saltwater stinging mercilessly in every tiny cut and abrasion. Splinters from the undecked hull or the rough-hewn oars were a daily hazard, burrowing insidiously under fingernails or into palms, often becoming painfully infected in the unhygienic conditions. Seasickness was a frequent and profoundly unwelcome companion, especially for new or less hardy sailors, or in particularly rough, churning seas. It wasn't a brief passing inconvenience. It could be a debilitating multi-day ordeal of misery, leaving you weak, wretchedly dehydrated, and retching up what little miserable bilge-flavored food you'd managed to consume, much to the weary amusement, or sometimes just weary indifference, of your more seasoned and stoic, or just emptier crewmates. When the sun, that fickle celestial tease, did decide to make an appearance, it often brought its own unique torments. Painful sunburn on any foolishly exposed skin, cracked and bleeding lips, and the blinding, merciless glare off the water that left your eyes aching and watering. Windburn was its constant, abrasive companion, leaving your face feeling raw and chafed. And then there was the itch. Oh, the glorious, inescapable, maddening itch. Coarse woolen clothing, probably teeming with a lively population of lice and fleas, your unwelcome, unpaying, and incredibly prolific passengers, rubbed relentlessly against salt-caked, irritated skin, leading to a persistent, infuriating itch that you could never quite satisfy, only aggravate. Every movement was a fresh reminder of some small, nagging pain, a discordant symphony of minor bodily agonies that coalesced over time into a state of chronic, weary, physical misery. And the smells. Oh, the rich, complex, and utterly unforgettably appalling bouquet that constituted life aboard a Viking longship on an extended trading voyage. Pride of place in this olfactory hall of fame undoubtedly went to the bilge, that delightful, sloshing reservoir in the very bottom of the boat, where seawater, mixed liberally with rainwater, spilled food scraps, discarded fish guts, the inevitable contributions of seasick sailors, animal waste if any unfortunate livestock were aboard, and anything else that happened to slosh, drip, or fall down there, would gradually fester and ferment into a truly unique and memorably gag-inducing perfume. It was the ship's signature scent, an ambient aroma that clung tenaciously to your clothes, your hair, and your very soul long after you'd gratefully made landfall, often announcing your profession to anyone with a functioning nose from a considerable distance. Then there was the deeply personal scent of unwashed humanity. Imagine, if you will, dozens of men, sweating, toiling, eating, sleeping, and being frequently and violently seasick in a confined, poorly ventilated space for weeks or even months on end, with bathing being a distant, almost mythical luxury, and often a practical impossibility in frigid waters. Add to this the pervasive aroma of their damp, rarely cleaned, coarse woolen clothing, which probably hosted its own thriving ecosystem of molds, mildews, and various interesting bacteria. The food, such as it was, contributed its own distinctive notes to this complex symphony of stench. The sharp ammoniac tang of slowly fermenting dried or salted fish, the dusty, slightly sour smell of old, weevil-ridden hardtack or coarse grain, the vinegary sourness of stale ale or bacterially adventurous drinking water. The tar used to seal the hull planks, while essential for keeping the ocean on the outside, added its own pungent, slightly acrid, medicinal scent to the overall mix, if you were carrying a particularly fragrant cargo, such as uncured hides, blocks of pungent cheese, or barrels of rendered whale blubber. these would generously contribute their own powerful, often overwhelming miasmas to the shipboard atmosphere. It was an olfactory assault course, a constant, inescapable reminder that you were marinating in a rich, primordial soup of organic decay, human effort, and profound regret. The sharp, metallic, coppery tang of fear, sharp and distinct in your nostrils during moments of extreme peril or near capsizing, was perhaps the only smell that could temporarily overpower the others, though it was rarely a welcome distraction. All right, so our intrepid Viking trader is born into misery, meticulously trained in the finer points of enduring misery, and now lives out a daily grind steeped in comprehensive misery. But surely, you cry, he had tools, ingenious equipment, cutting-edge Norse technology to ease his burden, to tame the wild waves, to conquer the unforgiving elements. Well, ease, tame, and conquer might be slightly overstating the case. Let's instead say he possessed a collection of things that were, in theory, supposed to help him survive and perhaps even turn a modest profit. In practice, however, these items often just added exciting new dimensions to his already multifaceted suffering. His relationship with these tools was less a harmonious partnership and more a dysfunctional, codependent, ongoing squabble with various inanimate, and sometimes stubbornly animate, objects, many of which seemed to possess a mischievous, frequently malevolent, and deeply uncooperative sentience. Behold the Viking Longship, a sleek, formidable, dragon-proud marvel of ancient Scandinavian engineering, a potent symbol of Norse maritime power and audacious reach, and also, if we're being brutally honest, a remarkably long, comparatively narrow, almost entirely open-topped wooden trough that its crew voluntarily, if not always enthusiastically, sailed directly into some of the world's most furious, freezing, and inhospitable waters. Its famed clinker-built hull, constructed with overlapping planks cleverly riveted together, endowed it with a certain renowned flexibility, allowing it to breathe with the relentless motion of the waves. This poetic breathing, however, often translated in practical terms into generously admitting large quantities of icy seawater through numerous small, constantly shifting gaps, thereby ensuring that the concept of dry remained a purely theoretical, almost mythical state for everyone unfortunate enough to be aboard. The shallow draft of the vessel was indeed excellent for rapidly zipping up unsuspecting rivers for a spot of light pillaging, a popular, if somewhat frowned upon, sideline for some traders, or for conveniently beaching the vessel on shores that conspicuously lacked proper port facilities, which, in fairness, was most of them. However, when caught in a heaving, confused North Atlantic megastorm, that same shallow draft could make the Longship feel disconcertingly like a very small, very fragile leaf being tossed about in a very large, very angry, and very indifferent puddle, prone to being flung about with terrifying stomach-churning abandon. Its open design, much lauded by saga writers for allowing fierce warriors to leap ashore unimpeded and ready for action, also thoughtfully provided an unparalleled 360-degree surround sound, full immersion experience of every single drop of freezing rain, every biting gust of wind, and every ton-heavy wave that decided, uninvited, to come aboard for an extended visit. Shelter, you ask? That was what the cramped space under an oar bench was for, if you were particularly small, incredibly lucky, and didn't mind sharing your limited refuge with the perpetually sloshing bilge water and whatever curious, multi-legged creatures resided therein. The Longship wasn't just a passive vehicle. It was a demanding, temperamental, high-maintenance beast. It required constant, wearying attention, ceaseless caulking of its perpetually weeping seams with a delightful mixture of sticky tar and coarse animal hair, and relentless vigilance against the insidious rot that gnawed patiently at its timbers. It groaned under strain. It flexed alarmingly. It shuddered violently, and it leaked persistently, all the while carrying our trader and his precious, and probably increasingly damp, cargo through zones of mortal peril, usually complaining loudly, in its own wooden way, every single nautical mile of the arduous journey, when the wind, that fickle and often malicious sky tyrant, decided to abandon ship and leave you becalmed. Out came the oars. We've previously touched upon the sheer, unadulterated joy of endless rowing, but the oars themselves deserve a special, dishonorable mention. Crafted from sturdy lengths of pine or ash, they were nonetheless infuriatingly prone to developing a deeply vindictive personality at the most inopportune moments. An oar might, for instance, choose the exact second of your most desperate life or death pull against a monstrous, ship-swallowing wave to crack with a sound like Odin's own femur snapping loudly, sending you tumbling backwards into your bewildered crewmates like a felled ninepin. Or it might develop a sudden aggressive constellation of razor-sharp splinters, perfectly positioned to embed themselves deep within your already tortured, bleeding palms. The oar ports, those cunningly designed holes in the ship's side through which the oars were worked, were also charmingly effective at inviting small targeted jets of icy seawater to spurt directly and accurately into your lap, or even better, your face, with every single stroke, just in case you were experiencing a fleeting, unacceptable moment's respite from the general misery. Then there was the sail, a single large, stubbornly square sheet of heavy, coarsely woven wool, or, if you were exceptionally fortunate, linen, often dyed in bold, warlike colors that probably did very little to intimidate a Force 10 gale but might have looked quite fetching from a distance, if anyone was watching. Its main party trick, its defining characteristic, was its spectacular, almost defiant inability to take you anywhere you actually wanted to go if the wind wasn't blowing from a generally favorable posterior direction. Tacking against the wind in a square-rigged longship was a vastly complex, incredibly laborious, and largely inefficient nautical ballet that involved a great deal of fervent shouting, frantic rope hauling, strategic swearing, and ultimately gaining very little actual ground towards your destination. When wet, which it almost invariably was, the sail weighed approximately the same as a small deceased whale, making it a monstrous, unwieldy beast to hoist, lower, or reef in a hurry, especially when the deck was slick with ice and the ship was pitching like a possessed rocking horse. Its vital hide or hemp ropes and rigging, the sinews of the ship, would stretch unpredictably, shrink inconveniently, freeze solid into unworkable iron bars, or simply snap with a depressing gunshot-like twang at the most critically inconvenient moments, usually when a sudden violent squall hit and you were desperately trying to reduce canvas before the mast decided to part company with the ship in a dramatic and probably fatal fashion. And let's not forget the steering oar. This wasn't a nice, simple, centrally mounted rudder safely tucked away at the stern. No, this was a large, cumbersome, specialized oar, almost a secondary mast in itself, mounted somewhat precariously on the starboard, the steerboard, hence the name, if you were wondering, side near the stern of the vessel. This was your primary, and indeed only, means of directional control, a weighty responsibility usually entrusted to the most experienced, or perhaps just the least terrified, man on board. It was surprisingly effective when all was well, but also incredibly vulnerable. Just try to imagine the sheer, sphincter-tightening, heart-stopping terror of that massive steering oar snapping clean off in the midst of a howling storm, leaving your longship wallowing helplessly, beam on, to face a relentless onslaught of mountainous, ship-crushing waves. It was the sort of catastrophic event that prompted fervent, immediate, and highly unorthodox prayers to any god, demon, or vaguely influential supernatural entity who might conceivably be listening, and probably to a few who definitely weren't. So how did our intrepid Viking trader find his way across vast, featureless, often furiously agitated expanses of ocean, frequently under perpetually overcast skies, or through disorienting, impenetrable fog banks? Well, it was a delightful, if terrifying blend of keen observation, when there was anything to observe, carefully memorized inherited knowledge, often of dubious accuracy, sheer, unadulterated guts, and a very healthy, possibly life-sustaining dose of blind, desperate hope. The legendary sunstone, or solarstein, a type of naturally polarizing crystal like cordierite, which could supposedly help detect the sun's elusive position even through fairly thick cloud cover by observing changes in polarized skylight, sounds wonderfully mystical and reassuringly scientific. In grim reality, its effectiveness was likely quite limited, probably most useful when the sun was only lightly obscured and rendered utterly, laughably useless in thick fog, heavy snow, or continuous leaden cloud cover, which, as we've tirelessly established, was pretty much standard operating procedure for the North Atlantic shipping lanes. One can easily imagine the crushing disappointment. Right, lads, break out the magical destiny-guiding rock, followed by a tense pause, and then the navigator's mournful pronouncement, "Oh, still comprehensively gray. Anyone seen any particularly interesting bits of seaweed floating by lately? Or perhaps a prophetic seabird?" Landmarks, of course, were crucial, when you were actually near land and could see it. Experienced navigators painstakingly memorized vast, intricate stretches of coastline, the distinctive shapes of particular cliffs, the exact positions of treacherous offshore islands, and the telltale signs of hidden reefs. But what about when you were out of sight of land for days, or even weeks, on end? Or when that anxiously awaited coastline was entirely shrouded in impenetrable fog, driving rain, or swirling snow, and every single gray, menacing rock looked exactly like every other gray, menacing rock you'd nearly crashed the ship into yesterday. They diligently watched the flight patterns of birds, knowing that certain species, like gannets or fulmars, tended to fly towards land at dusk to roost. This was often helpful, unless the birds in question were just as lost and confused as you were, or were simply heading out for a bit of recreational deep ocean fishing, thereby leading your hopeful, bird-following ship even further out into the desolate, foodless void. They observed subtle changes in wave patterns, the direction of prevailing currents, the color and temperature of the water, even the smell of the air, all tiny, nuanced clues that a truly skilled and exceptionally lucky navigator could piece together into a fragile hypothesis of their position. But it was, at best, an imprecise, nerve-wracking art, a high-stakes, continuous guessing game where a single significant miscalculation could mean missing your intended destination by hundreds of miles, running aground catastrophically on an unknown and possibly hostile shore, or, worst of all, simply sailing off determinedly into icy, uncharted oblivion. The constant, gnawing, gut-twisting anxiety of being irretrievably lost, of watching your precious food and water supplies dwindle with terrifying speed. With no GPS, no radio, no satellite phone, no one to call for help except the indifferent gods. Must have been a very heavy, very unwelcome passenger on every single perilous voyage. Now, you might reasonably assume that these hardy Norse seafarers, constantly exposed as they were to the very worst meteorological abuse the North Atlantic could gleefully dish out, would have possessed some truly excellent, state-of-the-art protective clothing designed to keep them warm and dry. You would, of course, be demonstrating an adorably optimistic and historically unfounded faith in ancient Norse haberdashery. As for their cutting-edge, high-performance personal protective equipment, it consisted primarily, and often exclusively, of whatever dead animal or obliging plant they could cunningly fashion into rudimentary garments. Think wool. Lots and lots of greasy, scratchy wool. Woolen tunics, woolen trousers, often of that distinctively fetching, slightly saggy and deeply drafty Viking cut. And heavy woolen cloaks, perhaps fastened with an ornate, but not particularly warm or waterproof, metal brooch. Wool, when perfectly dry and preferably still infused with a healthy amount of its natural lanolin, is indeed a decent insulator. However, the state of perfectly dry was an exceptionally rare and fleetingly transient condition for our Viking trader and his wardrobe. Once thoroughly saturated with icy seawater, driven spray, or relentless, sleety rain, which was, for all intents and purposes, its default operational condition. Wool becomes incredibly, punishingly heavy, miserably clammy, and takes approximately a geological epoch to even begin to dry in the context of a damp, unheated, poorly ventilated longship. So their much vaunted protective gear often transformed with depressing alacrity into a sodden, ponderous personal swamp that clung to them like a second colder skin, actively and efficiently leaching away precious life-sustaining body heat. They might also have possessed leather jerkins, sturdy caps, or rudimentary ill-fitting shoes, which offered a tad more wind resistance and a degree of protection from minor scrapes and abrasions. But leather, too, once thoroughly soaked, and it always got soaked, becomes stiff, cold, and remarkably uncomfortable, prone to chafing and rubbing in all the most unfortunate places. The very concept of breathable, waterproof membranes, of Gore-Tex, Thinsulate, or even basic oilskins, was still centuries away in the mists of future innovation, a distant, unimaginable dream beyond the wildest comprehension of a man whose primary sartorial concern was whether his current cloak was merely damp, actively sodden, or actually beginning to host new and interesting forms of marine life. Their primary protection against the relentless onslaught of the elements was less a technological solution and more a grim, daily exercise in stoic, teeth-chattering endurance, a prolonged, shivering, sniffling testament to the profound inadequacy of contemporary textile technology when faced with the full, unbridled fury of an oceanic winter. They weren't wearing foul weather gear. They were wearing mobile, personalized targets for pneumonia and frostbite. And yet, despite this never-ending daily catalog of failures, infuriating malfunctions, outright betrayals, and general stubborn uncooperativeness from their primary tools of the trade, our Viking trader couldn't just down tools and walk away in disgust. He couldn't trade in his leaky, unreliable longship for a newer, more reliable model with better fuel efficiency, heated seats, and a functioning GPS. This motley collection of often treacherous wood, fraying rope, and increasingly desperate wishful thinking was, quite simply, his life. His entire livelihood, his only means of feeding his hungry family back in some windswept fjord, his sole pathway to whatever passed for status or prosperity in his harsh and unforgiving world, was inextricably, irrevocably bound to these very instruments of his daily torment. It was an unholy matrimony, a deeply dysfunctional marriage of convenience, a bond forged not in mutual love or even grudging respect, but in shared pervasive misery and absolute mutual inescapable dependence. He would curse the ship with the most inventive, multisyllabic Norse profanities his desperate mind could conjure as it tried its level best to roll him bodily into the icy, unforgiving sea, and then mere minutes later be found desperately, frantically patching its ever-leaking hull with frozen, bleeding fingers to prevent them all from sinking without a trace. He'd swear eternal vengeance upon the oar that had just gifted him a fresh and bleeding set of blisters, then meticulously, almost tenderly, check it for hidden cracks or weaknesses, knowing full well that his life and the lives of his crewmates might depend on its questionable integrity come the morrow. The sail that had just torn spectacularly in the last vicious squall, nearly sending them all to dine with the sea goddess, ran in her watery halls, would be painstakingly, resentfully, and profanely stitched back together, stitch by bitter frozen stitch, with coarse, stiff thread and a needle carved from bone, even as the wind howled malevolently for an encore performance. This constant, wearying cycle of use, inevitable failure, grudging repair, and reluctant reuse bred a peculiar, deeply ambivalent relationship between man and tool. It certainly wasn't affection, not in any recognizable sense, but rather a deep, weary, and profoundly cynical form of enforced intimacy. They knew every groan of the ship's timbers, every weak spot in the aging rigging, every infuriating, unpredictable quirk of their vessel, not with fondness, but with the grim, exhaustive familiarity a long-suffering jailer might have for his most troublesome, incorrigible, and escape-prone prisoner. They maintained their tools not out of any sense of pride or love for the craft, but out of a stark, desperate, pragmatic necessity. A constant, grudging, losing battle waged against the relentless forces of entropy, decay, and the sea's insatiable, tireless attempts to reclaim its constituent materials. It was, in essence, a long-term partnership where one of the partners, the equipment, was frequently and actively trying to kill you, and your primary job was to bribe, bully, cajole, and occasionally sweet-talk it into not succeeding, at least for one more miserable, perilous voyage. So our Viking trader, equipped with tools that seemed to have been designed by Loki himself for maximum inconvenience and potential peril, somehow manages to survive his daily grind, at least for a while. But let's be clear, survive is a highly relative term in this context. The relentless, back-breaking labor, the brutal, unforgiving environment, and the constant gnawing stress didn't just pass him by without leaving a rather significant mark. Oh no. His body, that unwilling and frequently protesting participant in all his maritime misadventures, kept a meticulous, agonizingly detailed, and highly uncharitable record of every storm weathered, every oar pulled with frozen hands, every near-drowning experience, and every single freezing damp night spent shivering uncontrollably under a sodden cloak that offered more symbolic than actual warmth. By the time he reached what a pampered Frankish noble, ensconced in his drafty but undeniably solid stone castle, might consider his youthful prime. Say, 30 brutal winters, if he was exceptionally lucky, or particularly adept at dodging fate's curveballs. Our trader's physique was likely less a proud temple of robust Viking vitality, and more a dilapidated, creaking, weather-beaten outhouse of accumulated occupational hazards. His spine, after years of incessant heavy lifting, awkward hauling of oddly shaped cargo, and endless hours hunched miserably at an oar, or wrestling with a rebellious, oversized steering paddle, probably resembled less a proud, upright column, and more a badly carved question mark, fashioned from gnarled, unseasoned oak. It would be perpetually aching, frequently spasming at the most inconvenient moments, like when trying to avoid a swinging boom, and emitting a series of disturbing clicks, pops, and groans that rivaled the Longship itself for sheer range and expressiveness of suffering. His joints, particularly knees, elbows, shoulders, and hips, would serenade him with arias of agony with every significant movement, and often, just for variety, with many insignificant ones as well. Arthritis, bursitis, tendinitis, and a whole glorious symphony of other itises unknown to contemporary medicine, but painfully, intimately familiar to him, would have set in disturbingly early, relentlessly fueled by the constant, penetrating damp and the bone-chilling cold that were his constant companions. He probably rose in the morning, if rose is indeed the appropriate verb for the slow, agonizing, multi-stage process of unkinking his protesting limbs, with all the grace, speed, and fluidity of a rusty, centuries-old gate hinge being forced open in a blizzard. His hands, oh, his magnificent, utterly ruined hands, once perhaps in a dim and distant youth, capable of delicate work like carving a small wooden toy, or, Thor forbid, writing a rune or two, they were now transformed into gnarled, swollen claws, veritable roadmaps of unrelenting toil etched in permanently swollen knuckles, thickened, calloused palms as hard and unyielding as old, dried leather, and fingers that looked more like sausages left too long on the grill. Fingernails would be perpetually cracked, broken, split, or missing entirely. Unfortunate victims of being trapped between shifting cargo, crushed by falling equipment, or slowly succumbing to stubborn fungal infections. The fine motor skills required for, say, threading a needle or picking up a single dropped coin would be a distant, almost comical memory. Gripping an oar or a stiff, salt-encrusted rope in the freezing spray of a North Atlantic winter would be an exercise in pure, teeth-gritting, white-knuckled agony, the invasive cold seeping cruelly into old frostbite injuries, making his fingers burn and throb with a fiery, malevolent, inescapable pain. His feet, those unsung heroes of locomotion, were perpetually crammed into damp, ill-fitting, roughly stitched leather shoes or crude foot wrappings, or often simply left bare to the mercy of the cold, wet, splinter-strewn planks. They were, predictably, no better off than his hands. They'd be afflicted with something strikingly similar to trenchfoot, with skin that was pale, clammy, wrinkled, and alarmingly prone to cracking, bleeding, and infection. Chilblains, those itchy, burning, swollen little bastards, would be constant winter companions, making every step a carefully considered misery. Toenails, much like their counterparts on his fingers, would be thickened, discolored, ingrown, and generally offensive to the eye. The simple act of walking on a smooth, dry, stable floor, an almost mythical luxury, would feel strangely unstable and disconcerting after months spent constantly accommodating the unpredictable pitch, roll, and yaw of a ship determined to throw him off balance. His skin, that long-suffering outer envelope, constantly assaulted by corrosive salt, biting wind, the occasional treacherous blast of sun when it deigned to appear, and a standard of hygiene that would make a modern public health inspector weep, would be a leathery, wind-burned, salt-caked, cracked canvas of prolonged suffering. Boils, weeping rashes, painful, slow-healing salt sores, and remarkably stubborn fungal infections thriving in every warm, damp, unventilated crevice of his body were simply part of the unwelcome professional package. Minor cuts, scrapes, and abrasions, utterly inevitable in such a physically demanding and hazardous line of work, would fester and turn septic with alarming and often life-threatening speed in the conspicuous absence of effective antiseptics, clean dressings, or even basic soap. He probably bore more scars than a badly drawn treasure map, each one a silent testament to a moment of pain or peril. His eyes, those windows to his weary soul, were constantly squinting against the blinding sea glare, peering desperately through impenetrable fog, or straining to spot distant land, navigational markers, or potential danger in the dim, deceptive twilight of the northern latitudes. As a result, they would be chronically bloodshot, irritated, and watery. Infections like conjunctivitis, easily spread by dirty hands, rubbing tired eyes, would be depressingly common. The relentless exposure to harsh light and irritants might well lead to early cataracts or other debilitating vision impairments, making his already perilous job even more fraught with danger. He'd peer out at the horizon with the strained, red-rimmed, haunted gaze of a man who's seen far, far too much, and most of it was gray, unpleasant, and probably trying to kill him. And his teeth. Oh, the glorious, fearsome Viking smile, so beloved of Hollywood casting directors. In reality, it was likely less a display of pearly whites and more a haphazard collection of worn-down, chipped, cracked, and probably painfully abscessed nubs. Their standard diet of coarse, often grit-contaminated food, a little sand in the hardtack for texture, anyone, would inexorably grind down tooth enamel, while the near-total lack of dental hygiene and the potential for subclinical scurvy on longer, less nutritionally varied voyages would inevitably lead to rampant gum disease, loose teeth, chronic infections, and breath that could probably stun a particularly resilient seagull at 20 paces. For our trader, eating would often be a painful, arduous necessity, rather than a source of pleasure or comfort. Premature aging wasn't just a distant risk for our Viking trader. It was practically a job requirement, an unavoidable occupational hazard. A Viking seafarer or trader who somehow managed to survive to the ripe old age of 40, a significant achievement in itself, would likely carry the accumulated physical burdens and deeply weathered appearance of a man 20 years his senior in any gentler, land-based profession. His hair, if not already significantly thinned by stress, chronic malnutrition, and the sheer unfairness of it all, would be heavily streaked with gray. His face a craggy, deeply etched landscape of premature wrinkles, his posture permanently stooped from years of toil, his movements stiff, cautious, and deliberate. He was, in essence, a walking, groaning, aching monument to a life lived incredibly hard, incredibly fast, and incredibly uncomfortably. But it wasn't just the spectacular external injuries, the relentlessly aching joints, or the aesthetically displeasing array of skin conditions that made life so uniquely special for our Viking trader. Oh no. His chosen profession was also a remarkably generous and indiscriminate distributor of fascinating and debilitating internal afflictions, the kind of insidious ailments that didn't necessarily leave visible scars but could lay a strong man low with terrifying speed and efficiency. His unfortunate body wasn't just being systematically battered from the outside, it was frequently under active, hostile siege from within. One of the most common, least welcome, and most democratically unpleasant visitors aboard any longship was undoubtedly the flux, what we'd nowadays recognize with clinical detachment as dysentery or severe acute gastroenteritis. Given the often dubious quality of the drinking water, frequently stored for weeks on end in wooden barrels that were probably last properly cleaned sometime in the early Bronze Age, if ever, and the equally questionable standards of hygiene surrounding food preparation, just try to imagine attempting to keep your hands scrupulously clean while butchering a slippery fish on a wildly pitching deck awash with bilge water and gull droppings. Contracting it was almost inevitable. The symptoms were every bit as delightful as they sound: crippling, spasming abdominal cramps, violent, explosive diarrhea that respected neither time, place, nor personal dignity, raging fever, and rapid, dangerous dehydration. In the cramped, poorly ventilated, and already fragrant confines of a longship, a serious outbreak of the flux could swiftly incapacitate a significant portion of the crew, effectively turning the already less than salubrious vessel into a floating, open-air latrine of collective misery and highly efficient contagion. There were no IV drips for rehydration, no effective antibiotics to combat the infection, just a grim, desperate hope that you'd somehow manage to survive it through sheer stubbornness, or perhaps just die quickly and get it over with. Then there were the myriad afflictions of the lungs. Constant, unavoidable exposure to biting cold, penetrating damp, and howling winds, often coupled with periods of intense, lung-searing physical exertion, made serious respiratory illnesses a constant and often lethal threat. Lung fever, a rather vague but terrifying catch-all term for what was likely bacterial pneumonia or severe acute bronchitis, could very easily be a death sentence in that era. It would typically start with a persistent, racking cough, rapidly progress to high fever, stabbing chest pain, and increasing difficulty breathing, until the unfortunate sufferer was either slowly suffocating in his own accumulating lung fluids or, if he was incredibly tough, exceptionally lucky, or perhaps just too stubborn to die, slowly, agonizingly recovering, albeit with lungs likely scarred, compromised, and significantly weakened for the remainder of his shortened life. Even without succumbing to a full-blown, life-threatening infection, a chronic, hacking, productive cough that produced suspiciously colored and alarmingly textured phlegm was practically part of the standard Viking seafarer's daily ensemble. And let's not, for a moment, forget the subtle, insidious, creeping joys of chronic malnutrition and debilitating vitamin deficiencies. The typical seagoing diet of a Viking trader, heavily reliant on dried or salted meat and fish, often of questionable vintage and alarming pungency, incredibly hard, flinty hardtack that could double as a building material, and perhaps some carefully hoarded, increasingly sad-looking, and nutritionally devoid root vegetables, wasn't exactly a shining example of a balanced, health-promoting nutritional profile, while full-blown, florid scurvy, with its dramatically rotting gums, loose teeth, and terrifying spontaneous bleeding, might have been slightly less common on the relatively shorter, though still arduous, hops between Norway, Iceland, and the British Isles, compared to truly epic transoceanic voyages undertaken by later explorers. Subclinical deficiencies of essential vitamins and minerals were almost certainly rampant and debilitating. This meant chronically weakened immune systems, making them more susceptible to every passing infection. Poor, slow wound healing, turning minor cuts into major, festering problems. Persistent lethargy, and a general, pervasive lack of vitality and resilience. They were, in effect, attempting to fuel a Formula One engine of extreme physical exertion with the nutritional equivalent of damp sawdust and wishful thinking. The inevitable result was a level of profound, bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that no amount of sleep, even if uninterrupted restful sleep, were readily available and not constantly interrupted by storms, leaks, or the snores of 20 unwashed crewmates, could truly dent or alleviate. It was a profound weariness that settled deep into their very marrow, a constant, unwelcome companion, as reliably present as the cold, the damp, and the ever-present smell of fish. While our Viking trader's unfortunate body was engaged in a constant, wearying, and ultimately losing battle against the hostile elements and its own inexorable, premature decline, his mind was simultaneously fighting its own silent, often far more terrifying and deeply isolating war. The physical toll of such a life was undeniably brutal. Yes, but the unremitting psychological strain could be equally, if not more, corrosive, slowly but surely grinding away at a man's spirit and sanity, until only a hollow, echoing shell of weary, traumatized resilience remained. There was, first and foremost, the ever-present, low-humming, gut-churning thrum of fear. Not necessarily the dramatic, theatrical shrieking terror beloved of Hollywood movies, though there were certainly ample moments for that particular flavor of panic too, but a more insidious, gnawing background anxiety that lived permanently in the pit of the stomach, a cold knot of dread. There was the fear of the sudden, unpredictable, overwhelming violence of storms, the kind that could snap a thick mast like a dry twig and send mountainous, hungry waves crashing relentlessly over the decks, threatening to wash everything and everyone unceremoniously into the churning, indifferent, icy abyss. There was the deep, primal fear of getting hopelessly, irretrievably lost in the vast, featureless, monochromatic expanse of the open ocean, of seeing the last barrel of precious fresh water run dry, the last piece of maggot-riddled hardtack consumed, with no land in sight and no hope of rescue. There was the chilling, culturally ingrained fear of the unseen, monstrous terrors that were firmly believed to lurk in the dark, crushing depths beneath the waves, the colossal island-sized kraken, the ship-swallowing Hafgufa, the world-encircling Jörmungandr, whose terrifying existence was as real and tangible to them as the rough wooden planks of the ship beneath their feet. Their shadowy imagined forms could be glimpsed in the turbulent trough of a wave or conjured by a fevered mind in the swirling, disorienting chaos of a nocturnal storm. And of course, layered on top of all this was the very real, very immediate, and highly tangible fear of human predators, ruthless pirates, fiercely territorial and hostile coastal dwellers, or even rival traders whose ethical codes were as flexible and accommodating as a well-oiled hinge on a treasure chest. All of these charming individuals stood ready and willing to relieve you of your hard-won cargo, your precious ship, and quite possibly your life, with extreme prejudice and a horrifying variety of very sharp, very pointy metal objects. This pervasive fear was a cold, metallic taste in the mouth, a permanent tightness in the chest, a constant unwelcome companion that, while it might have sharpened the senses to a razor's edge, also inexorably frayed the nerves to breaking point. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing, mind-numbing monotony. Between the adrenaline-fueled episodes of stark terror and frantic, desperate activity, there were often vast, empty, featureless stretches of time filled with absolutely nothing but the endless, unchanging gray sea, the endless, oppressive gray sky, and the endless, repetitive creak, groan, and splash of the ship. Days, sometimes even weeks, could drag by with little to break the profound tedium beyond the same old repetitive tasks of sailing, rowing, bailing, and basic, grim survival. This wasn't a contemplative, peaceful, restorative solitude. It was an oppressive, isolating, sanity-eroding boredom that could dull the mind, crush the spirit, and leech the will to live. It was a vast, empty canvas upon which anxieties, dark thoughts, and half-forgotten fears could paint their most vivid, disturbing, and unwelcome masterpieces. The profoundly dehumanizing nature of the relentless labor also took its inevitable toll. For the average crewman on a trading vessel, there was precious little agency or individual recognition. He was, for all practical purposes, simply a pair of hands, a strong back, a unit of muscle power, a replaceable cog in the vast, impersonal machine of the voyage. He was expected to obey orders instantly and without question, to endure unimaginable hardship without complaint or weakness. His individual hopes, his private fears, his nagging discomforts were largely, if not entirely, irrelevant to the grim overarching calculus of getting the ship and its valuable cargo from Port A to Port B with minimal loss. This pervasive sense of being expendable, of your own life being objectively valued at less than a barrel of good quality Rhenish wine or a bolt of fine Flemish cloth, could inexorably erode a man's sense of self-worth, leaving behind a bitter residue of weary cynicism, bleak resignation, or impotent rage. Even when crammed onto a crowded ship, surrounded day and night by his fellow crewmates, a profound and terrible sense of isolation could easily creep in and take root, while camaraderie undoubtedly existed, often forged fiercely in the crucible of shared suffering, common purpose, and mutual dependence for survival. The brutal competitive conditions and the constant grinding struggle for personal survival could also breed suspicion, paranoia, petty rivalries, and a dangerous hardening of the heart. Showing weakness, either physical or emotional, was often not a viable option in such a harsh masculine environment. Emotional expression was likely strictly limited to displays of gruffness, sudden bursts of anger, or the occasional eruption of bleak, despairing gallows humor. Each man was, in many significant ways, an isolated island of private misery and unspoken fear, even while physically surrounded by his equally suffering fellows. How did they possibly cope with this unholy trinity of physical agony, mental anguish, and existential dread? Norse culture, to its credit, offered some frameworks, some psychological life rafts, however flimsy. A strong, deeply ingrained belief in fate, in the concept of weird or urdur, meant that one's ultimate destiny, for good or for ill, was already irrevocably woven by the shadowy figures of the Norns at the foot of Yggdrasil. This powerful fatalism could, paradoxically, bring a certain stoic acceptance of hardship, a grim understanding that struggling too violently against the inevitable was ultimately pointless and undignified. They made offerings, small propitiatory sacrifices, to appease the vast pantheon of often capricious gods. Thor for protection from storms and giants, Njordr for safe sea passage and bountiful fishing. Perhaps a desperate last-ditch prayer to the terrifying sea goddess Ran and her 9 daughters if things looked truly, catastrophically dire, and the waves were already breaking over the gunwales. Omens and portents were watched for with anxious, almost obsessive attention. The specific behavior of birds. Ravens were particularly significant. The ominous shape of clouds, troubling dreams, a sudden unexplained creak from the ship's timbers. Anything, absolutely anything, that might offer even a sliver of ambiguous insight into the hostile intentions of the universe or the whims of the gods. Dark, savage humor, as sharp and brutal as a well-honed axe, was likely a common currency, a vital psychological defense mechanism, a way to laugh defiantly in the leering face of death, despair, and a hostile cosmos. And, of course, when available, alcohol, rough, strong ale, or potent, honeyed mead, would offer a temporary, if ultimately unhelpful and often problematic, respite from the biting cold, the gnawing fear, and the crushing, relentless weight of their precarious existence. A brief, blurry, welcome escape before the harsh, unforgiving realities of the next gray dawn inevitably, and all too quickly, intruded. One might naively think that after battling monstrous, ship-swallowing seas, contending with malevolent, God-breathed weather, narrowly avoiding, or perhaps just not noticing, mythical beasts lurking in the abyssal depths, and wrestling with their own rebellious, aching bodies, our long-suffering Viking trader might at least find some small solace, some measure of comfort or understanding, in his interactions with fellow human beings. One would, yet again, be engaging in a delightful, hopelessly optimistic flight of fancy, far removed from the gritty, frequently unpleasant, and universally complicated realities of Norse interpersonal dynamics, especially when commerce, discomfort, and the constant threat of imminent death were involved. Often, the other humans involved in his voyages were not a source of comfort or camaraderie, but just another irksome layer of irritation, another potent source of simmering stress, another complicated, unpredictable hazard to be navigated with extreme caution, a stoic expression, and perhaps a conveniently loosened axe. Presiding with iron-fisted and probably salt-caked authority over this floating, leaking purgatory was the skipper, the steersman, or ship's master. This was the man whose word was law, whose authority within the confines of the Longship was as absolute and unquestionable as the king's on dry land, and often considerably more immediate and painful if defied. His mood, which could fluctuate as wildly and unpredictably as the North Atlantic weather, could dictate the collective misery levels of the entire crew with terrifying, almost supernatural precision. With luck, he might be a seasoned, competent, if brutally hard, mariner. His face would be a leathery, wind-scoured testament to 1,000 storms weathered and 1,000,000 nautical miles navigated, his narrowed eyes missing nothing, from the faintest shift in wind direction to the slightest sign of insubordination amongst the crew. This kind of skipper, while often as tough as bog oak, as demanding as a hungry wolf pack, and possessed of a vocabulary consisting mainly of barks, growls, and creative profanities, at least inspired a certain grudging confidence that you might, just might, against all odds, see land again. He knew the currents like the lines on his own calloused palm. He could smell an approaching storm hours before it hit, and his commands, though invariably delivered with the aggressive ferocity of a recently awakened and profoundly irritated bear, usually made some sort of grim, pragmatic sense. However, the Norns were fickle, and you could just as easily draw the short, splintered straw and end up serving under a skipper who was breathtakingly arrogant, dangerously incompetent, overly cautious to the point of complete paralysis when action was desperately needed, or perhaps worst of all, recklessly, suicidally bold to the point of actively seeking out trouble. Perhaps he'd inherited his ship, but not his father's keen sea sense. Or maybe he was just an unlucky, blustering bastard whose primary maritime skill was shouting very, very loudly, and then expertly blaming others for his own glaringly poor decisions. This latter type of skipper was a special, refined kind of hell. His pervasive anxieties would manifest as a constant barrage of incessant, often contradictory orders. His temper would flare with volcanic intensity at the slightest real or imagined provocation. A dropped oar, a poorly coiled rope, an insufficiently terrified or excessively cheerful expression on a crewman's weary face. His navigational decisions often seemed based more on a recent bout of severe indigestion, or a particularly vivid, unhelpful dream than on any actual discernible understanding of the sea, the stars, or basic common sense. Regardless of his individual level of competence or sanity, the skipper was the one who unilaterally determined when you ate, if indeed at all, when you slept, rarely and poorly, and precisely how much collective suffering was deemed an acceptable daily operational quota. He was the one who'd inspect the precious cargo with an eagle eye that could spot a single damp patch on a bale of wool from 50 paces, and who would be incredibly quick to assign blame, and often a painful summary punishment or a significantly docked share of the voyage's meager profits for any perceived damage, shortfall, or minor infraction. He was, in short, the localized, often terrifying demigod of your miserable little floating world, and his divine, frequently bellowed pronouncements were, more often than not, deeply, profoundly inconvenient for everyone else. Then there was the merchant, the anxious, profit-obsessed owner of the precious, inanimate cargo you were actively risking your life, limbs, and sanity to transport across vast, murderous stretches of ocean. This esteemed individual, if he deigned to travel with his goods, though often he'd wisely, and with a keen sense of self-preservation, send a less important, more expendable agent in his stead, was typically a creature of singular, unwavering, almost religious focus. His merchandise, whether it was barrels of fine Flemish wool that cost more than your entire family, stacks of Irish linen smoother than a baby's bottom, crates of valuable walrus ivory destined for some king's trinket box, blocks of easily chipped soapstone for carving, heavy bulks of timber, or even a consignment of very disgruntled, probably rebellious thralls. These items were, in his calculating eyes, infinitely more precious and worthy of concern than the continued existence or relative comfort of the weather-beaten, expendable crew. He would hover anxiously, almost lovingly, over his bales, barrels, and bundles, wringing his hands with theatrical despair at every significant lurch or roll of the ship, convinced beyond all reason that each splash of errant seawater was a personal affront, a deliberate conspiracy orchestrated by the crew and the malevolent sea god specifically to ruin his carefully calculated profit margins. He'd complain bitterly, loudly, and at great length about the perceived slowness of the voyage if the winds were unfavorable. "Can't you make this wretched tub go any faster, you lazy dogs? My markets await, and time is silver." Yet would scream blue apoplectic murder if a necessary risk was taken to speed things up, like sailing closer to a lee shore, that resulted in even a single strand of his precious wool getting slightly damp. He'd peer suspiciously and constantly at the crew, his beady eyes darting about, utterly convinced that they were all systematically pilfering his goods whenever his back was turned. And to be fair, on occasion, driven by hunger and desperation, they might indeed be, if only to supplement their own pitiful, starvation-level rations. Upon arrival at the destination, assuming you actually made it, he would haggle with ruthless, shameless tenacity over the previously agreed-upon freight charges, meticulously pointing out every perceived flaw in the delivery, every slight, unavoidable delay, every imagined scratch on his precious inanimate commodities, all in a relentless effort to shave a few more miserable silver pennies off your crew's hard-earned, blood-soaked pay. Gratitude for your Herculean, life-risking efforts in successfully conveying his worldly wealth safely across a murderous, monster-infested ocean was a concept as alien and incomprehensible to him as a warm bath, a balanced diet, or basic human decency. Sometimes, just to add an extra layer of spice to the voyage, the Longship might be obliged to carry passengers not directly involved in the primary trading venture itself. Perhaps a minor, self-important noble on some tedious, ill-defined diplomatic mission to a remote chieftain. Maybe a nervous, pale-faced cleric clutching a wooden cross, hoping to convert some unappreciative heathens, and probably deeply, profoundly regretting his career choice with every single nauseating wave. It could be a stoic, bewildered family of settlers, complete with crying babies and all their worldly goods, heading for the newly discovered, probably equally miserable, lands in Iceland or Greenland. Or perhaps just another, smaller-scale independent trader who couldn't afford his own ship, but had somehow managed to book passage. These individuals, almost universally unaccustomed to the unique rigors and profound discomforts of extended sea travel in an open boat, often added a unique and particularly unwelcome flavor of misery to the already challenging voyage. They would invariably, and with spectacular predictability, become catastrophically, projectilely seasick in the most inconvenient, confined, and public locations, usually directly to windward of you and your meager meal. They'd complain incessantly, in whining, high-pitched tones, about the quality of the food, which, to be absolutely fair, was objectively terrible, but it was your crew's terrible, and you'd all learn to live with it, or at least die quietly from it. They'd take up valuable, limited space with their persons and their unnecessary baggage, somehow always managing to get directly in the way during vital, time-sensitive ship-handling maneuvers, like reefing the sail in a sudden squall or avoiding an imminent collision. They would ask an endless, bewildering stream of profoundly stupid, easily answerable or utterly irrelevant questions at the worst possible moments. The haughty, aristocratic ones would expect a level of deference, service, and comfort that the overworked, underfed crew had neither the time, the resources, nor the slightest inclination to provide. The timid, fearful ones would simply add to the general background hum of anxiety and dread with their constant irritating whimpering, their audible, ostentatious prayers, and their overt, unnerving displays of uncontrolled terror. They were, in essence, mobile, complaining, space-consuming cargo that you couldn't even, unfortunately, sell at the other end for a profit. Did anyone ever pause, once the hazardous voyage was miraculously concluded, the cargo safely, if damply, unloaded, and the merchant gleefully, or at least relievedly, counting his ill-gotten coins, to clap our weary Viking trader fulfillment on the aching back and exclaim, "Well done, old chap. A truly marvelous job navigating us through that horrendous ice storm and bravely fighting off those bloodthirsty pirates. You are, without a doubt, a shining credit to your noble profession, and here's a hefty, unexpected bonus in silver for your extraordinary skill, unwavering bravery, and general lack of dying." The statistical probability of such an event occurring was roughly equivalent to a sea serpent spontaneously volunteering to learn accountancy and help with the ship's ledgers. No. Genuine appreciation was a rare and exotic foreign currency, one seldom traded in the harsh, unforgiving markets of the Viking world, at least not downwards in the social hierarchy. Competence, in their line of work, was simply expected. A bare minimum baseline requirement for not being immediately thrown overboard, severely flogged, or sold to the nearest slaver. Survival and the reasonably intact delivery of goods were the minimum acceptable standards, not legitimate cause for effusive celebration or tangible reward for the grimy, exhausted grunts doing the actual, life-threatening work. If you, through a combination of exceptional skill, quick, desperate thinking, or sheer, dumb, blind luck, managed to avert an imminent disaster, say, by ingeniously patching a critical, gushing leak mid-storm using only your own trousers and a lot of hope, or by cleverly outmaneuvering a larger, faster, and overtly hostile vessel in a running sea battle, your primary reward was, well, not dying a horrible death that particular day. And perhaps, just perhaps, not getting blamed quite as vociferously if something else inevitably went wrong later in the voyage. Failure, however, in any of its many and varied forms, was invariably met with swift, predictable, and often brutally disproportionate consequences. A significantly damaged cargo, a lost or wrecked ship, a catastrophically missed market or deadline. These professional mishaps would almost certainly result in savagely docked pay, painful beatings, instant dismissal, potential enslavement if you were already in debt to the skipper or merchant, or simply being cast adrift in your professional reputation, unable to find another berth on any reputable or even disreputable vessel. The immense, exhausting physical effort, the hard-won, specialized knowledge of winds, currents, and coastlines, the incredible, almost superhuman endurance required, the constant, nerve-shredding risk to life and limb, all of it was largely invisible, unacknowledged, and entirely unappreciated by those who ultimately profited from it. The skipper might, if he was lucky, and the voyage was particularly profitable, receive a grudging nod, or a slightly larger share from the merchant. But the average crewman, our Viking trader, was seen as little more than a renewable, expendable resource. Another pair of frostbitten hands to pull an oar or haul a rope, easily replaceable at the next port of call. Utterly, tragically expendable. You weren't a skilled professional mariner in their eyes. You were a tool, a piece of biological equipment, and tools don't get thank you notes or performance bonuses. They just get worn out, broken, and eventually discarded. And what of his companions in this floating, leaking, creaking, stinking microcosm of collective misery? His fellow crewmen, his supposed shield brothers in the endless, exhausting war against the waves, the wind, the ice, and their own steadily dwindling sanity? Surely here, at least amidst those who shared his wretched lot, was a reliable haven of mutual understanding, steadfast support, and heartwarming camaraderie. Well, sometimes, and sometimes not so very much. The intricate web of relationships within the confines of a Viking longship's crew was a complex, highly volatile, and often dangerously unpredictable brew, a potent mixture of grudging, hard-won respect, deeply shared suffering, simmering, unspoken resentment, the occasional surprising flicker of genuine, if usually brutally unspoken, camaraderie, and a healthy dose of well-founded suspicion. On the one hand, there was undoubtedly a powerful, almost primal bond forged in the unforgiving crucible of shared, inescapable hell. Only another man who had shivered uncontrollably through the same endless freezing nights, bailed the same relentless, stinking bilge water with aching arms, faced down the same terrifying ship-smashing storms with a dry mouth and a pounding heart, and somehow managed to stomach the same maggoty, tasteless hardtack for weeks on end, could ever truly understand the grim, unvarnished reality of their collective existence. This profound shared experience could, on occasion, create a powerful, unspoken solidarity, a sense of us against the world, and the sea, and the skipper. An older, more experienced sailor might quietly, without fanfare, show a terrified, clumsy greenhorn a more efficient, life-saving way to tie a crucial knot, not necessarily out of pure altruism, but because an incompetent, panicking crewman was a lethal danger to everyone on board. Food, when it was particularly scarce or marginally less disgusting than usual, might sometimes be shared with a sick or injured mate, albeit often grudgingly, and with a careful accounting of future reciprocity. A calloused hand might be silently offered to help someone struggling with a dangerously heavy load, a wordless, utilitarian acknowledgement of their mutual dependence for survival. Laughter, when it miraculously occurred, was usually a harsh, barking, deeply cynical sound, often at the expense of someone else's immediate misfortune, a particularly inept passenger, or a shared, grimly ironic observation about the sheer bloody awfulness of their current predicament. This was the bleak gallows humor of the condemned, a defiant, if futile, way of spitting in the eye of a cruel and indifferent fate. On the other hand, constant, gnawing privation, unrelenting, nerve-shredding stress, and the incredibly close, inescapable, enforced proximity of dozens of armed, often aggressive, highly competitive, and frequently deeply uncomfortable men in a severely confined, unhygienic space for months at a time could just as easily breed simmering tension, bitter rivalry, petty jealousies, and outright explosive hostility. A rigid, often brutal hierarchy invariably existed on board. The skipper, of course, was at the undisputed apex, a lonely, often paranoid god. He was followed by his trusted officers, or veteran, battle-hardened hands, then the bulk of the merely experienced, competent crew, and somewhere far down at the very bottom of this precarious pecking order, the new recruits, the young boys still wet behind the ears, and anyone else perceived as weak, clumsy, unlucky, or otherwise incompetent. Bullying of those on the lower rungs of this floating ladder was depressingly common, a convenient and time-honored way for those slightly higher up the greasy pole to vent their own accumulated frustrations, assert their minimal, hard-won status, and feel marginally less wretched by making someone else feel even worse. A complex network of unspoken rules, taboos, and expectations governed life on board, and transgressions, whether real or perceived, could be met with swift, often disproportionately brutal, informal justice. Don't ever touch another man's meager, precious possessions. His personal knife, his drinking cup, his pathetic share of the day's rations, his lucky amulet. Don't ever be seen to shirk your assigned duties, thereby forcing others to pick up your dangerous slack. Don't complain excessively or whine, unless, of course, everyone was complaining in unison, in which case it transformed into a vital, therapeutic, male-bonding ritual. Disputes over the equitable division of potential profit, a frequent source of murderous rage, venomous accusations of theft, a deadly serious offense in such close quarters, perceived insults to honor or manhood, or simple grating personality clashes fueled by exhaustion and hunger could easily, and with terrifying speed, flare into open, brutal violence. A sudden, desperate flash of drawn knives in the dim, flickering light of the hold, a savage, no-holds-barred fistfight on the slippery, heaving deck. These were not uncommon or particularly surprising ways of settling arguments when formal authority was distant, preoccupied, or simply indifferent to the simmering animosities within the crew. Loyalty to one's shipmates was highly prized in theory, a cornerstone of the Viking ethos, but raw, desperate self-preservation was often paramount in practice. In moments of extreme, life-threatening crisis, you might indeed witness incredible acts of selfless bravery and heroic self-sacrifice. But you might also just as easily witness craven acts of betrayal, as desperate, terrified men sought to save their own miserable skins, perhaps by subtly shifting blame onto an unsuspecting scapegoat, by callously hoarding scarce, life-saving resources, or by simply failing to offer a helping hand to a struggling comrade. It was, in truth, an unmerry, profoundly dysfunctional band of brothers, bound together not by genuine affection or shared ideals, but by the iron chains of shared ordeal, the slim, receding hope of eventual survival, and the even slimmer prospect of tangible profit. They were, at best, reluctant comrades in arms against the relentless fury of the sea, but sometimes, in their fear, desperation, and misery, they were just as dangerous, if not more so, to each other. After a hard day, or week, or perhaps even an entire miserable month of battling the elements, wrestling with recalcitrant and often actively hostile equipment, and navigating the treacherous, shark-infested currents of human interaction, our weary Viking trader surely looked forward to the comforting embrace of a hearty, nutritious meal, a warm, dry bed, and a long, uninterrupted night of deep, restorative sleep. Except, of course, he didn't, because comforts, heartiness, warmth, dryness, and uninterrupted sleep in his particular world were concepts as mythical, as elusive, and as frankly unbelievable as a well-behaved, house-trained kraken that offered helpful navigational advice. So let's peel back the greasy, salt-stiffened sealskin flap on the so-called luxuries of life aboard a Viking longship, and prepare yourselves for a veritable, overflowing smorgasbord of profound disappointment. Dining aboard your average Viking trading vessel, plying the gray and grumpy waters of the North Atlantic, was less a gastronomic experience and more a grim, relentless daily exercise in basic caloric intake and the cultivation of an iron-willed, almost zen-like indifference to taste, texture, aroma, and fundamental food safety. The ship's larder, if such a grand term could be applied to a few damp barrels and sacks crammed into the bilge, was not a place of delightful culinary discovery. It was a repository of regret, a museum of slowly decaying sustenance. The absolute, unshakable staple, the very bedrock of this miserable, monotonous diet, was likely hardtack, or sea biscuit, if you wish to cloak its grim reality in a deceptively charming, almost quaint, nautical diminutive. These were not, it must be stressed, your dear old grandma's fluffy, golden brown buttermilk biscuits, fresh from a warm oven. Oh no. These were dense, incredibly coarse, often alarmingly gritty cakes of flour, water, and perhaps a grudging sprinkle of salt, baked with relentless ferocity until they achieved a consistency somewhere between a medieval roofing tile and a piece of petrified prehistoric wood. Their primary, and perhaps only virtues, were that they were incredibly cheap to produce, lasted, in a manner of speaking, as edibility was a secondary concern, for a very, very long time, and could, in a desperate pinch, serve as a moderately effective blunt weapon, a small, uncomfortable pillow, or even a makeshift splint for a broken finger. They were often, as an added bonus, generously infested with industrious weevils and their plump, wriggling larvae, affectionately known as a ship's mutton by some particularly stoic or humorously inclined wags, providing an unwelcome, squirming, and entirely unsolicited source of extra protein. Consuming these culinary delights usually involved either soaking them for a considerable time in whatever dubious liquid was available, brackish water, sour ale, or if truly desperate, seawater, until they softened to a merely tooth-threatening, rather than actively tooth-shattering consistency, or simply gnawing on them with grim, jaw-aching determination, and fervently hoping that your existing dental work was fully up to the formidable challenge. Accompanying the ever-present hardtack, and providing what little variation the diet offered, would be vast quantities of dried or heavily salted fish, typically cod, herring, ling, or whatever other unfortunate, easily preserved denizen of the deep had been caught, ineptly gutted, and subjected to a brutal preservation process. This was fish that had been so thoroughly dehydrated or aggressively impregnated with coarse salt that it achieved a texture strongly reminiscent of ancient, discarded sandal leather and a pervasive, lingering pungency that could make your eyes water from the other end of the ship, even in a strong headwind. It was tough. It was relentlessly chewy. It was overpoweringly, inescapably fishy, and it was often served with a generous, unavoidable side of lingering fish scales and the occasional forgotten, needle-sharp fishbone, just to keep things interesting and provide a frisson of potential throat-perforating danger with every mouthful. Salted meat, perhaps stringy mutton, rank goat, or fatty pork, if they were exceptionally lucky, was another theoretical option. Though it was often of highly questionable quality and dubious origin, even before being unceremoniously packed in leaky barrels of murky brine. It would typically emerge months later, a ghastly shade of gray, unnervingly stringy, incredibly, inedibly salty, and bearing only a faint, highly unappetizing resemblance to its original animal form. Fresh food, that glorious dream, was an exceptionally rare and fleeting treat, usually only available for the first few precious days out of port, or if they somehow managed to catch some fresh fish or unfortunate seabirds en route, which then of course had to be cooked. A significant and often impossible challenge in itself on an open pitching boat. For drink, there was water naturally, stored for extended periods in rough wooden casks that were rarely, if ever, properly cleaned. This vital water would quickly become slimy, tepid, unpleasantly odorous, and develop a fascinating, self-sustaining ecosystem of its own, tasting vaguely and unpleasantly of algae, old wet wood, and profound, existential regret. It was often considered safer and marginally more palatable, a very low bar indeed, to drink ale or weak, home-brewed beer. This was usually a very low-alcohol, cloudy brew, less an intoxicant and more a slightly flavored, vaguely fermented liquid. But it at least had the distinct theoretical benefit of having been boiled at some point during its creation, which hopefully killed off some of the more enthusiastic and pathogenic bacteria lurking within. It was often sour, usually flat, and invariably served at whatever the ambient temperature happened to be, usually cold. But it was wet, and sometimes, in the desolate wastes of the ocean, that was genuinely all that mattered. Food preparation, if such a sophisticated and deliberate term could be justly applied to their culinary efforts, was absolutely minimal. A small, carefully sheltered firebox, perhaps a sand-filled stone hearth, wedged precariously amongst the cargo, might allow for some extremely rudimentary cooking or warming of food if the weather was exceptionally, miraculously calm, an almost unheard-of event in the North Atlantic. More often than not, however, food was eaten cold, as is, straight from the barrel or sack, or at best, lukewarm and unappetizing. The daily caloric intake derived from this delightful diet was probably just barely enough to keep them functioning, to fuel their back-breaking labor, but rarely, if ever, enough to make them feel truly satisfied, well-nourished, or even vaguely human. It was a diet meticulously designed for grim, joyless survival, not for pleasure or enjoyment. A monotonous, unappetizing, and frequently dangerously unhygienic culinary journey through various uninspiring shades of beige, gray, and profound, soul-wearying despair. And where, you might ask, did our long-suffering Viking trader lay his weary, aching head after a delightful evening repast of weevil-infested hardtack and desiccated fish jerky? His sleeping quarters, his private sanctuary, his cozy refuge from the storm and the stresses of the day? Prepare yourselves, dear listeners, for another crushing wave of profound, abject disappointment. Shelter on a Viking longship was a concept applied with remarkable lexical generosity and a distinct, almost comical, lack of actual architectural rigor or concern for basic human comfort. For the average unprivileged crewman, bed was not a specific designated piece of furniture, but rather a fiercely contested, frequently damp, and invariably hard patch of uneven deck. There were no cozy, built-in bunks, no private, lockable cabins, no gently swaying hammocks to lull one to sleep, unless you counted the entire bloody ship which swayed constantly, unpredictably, and usually with extreme nauseating violence. Your sleeping arrangements were largely, if not entirely, improvised, dictated by the limited available space not currently occupied by essential, often smelly, cargo, stacked oars, heavy coils of stiff rope, iron anchors, or most problematically, another, larger, smellier, and more aggressive Viking. Perhaps if the weather wasn't actively, maliciously trying to drown you all in your sleep, and the skipper was in an unusually benevolent, almost human mood, a tjald, a large, heavy woolen awning or rudimentary tent, might be laboriously erected over a portion of the open deck. This offered a modicum, a mere sliver, of nominal protection from direct, perpendicular rain, or the worst, most biting gusts of wind. But it was hardly a reliably waterproof, comfortably insulated, or even remotely pleasant haven. It would flap and crack noisily and incessantly in the wind like a banshee's shroud, leak enthusiastically from 1,000 tiny holes and seams, and efficiently trap the collective, concentrated aroma of damp wool, unwashed human bodies, stale fish, old vomit, and general despair in a remarkably potent, almost visible fug. More often than not, however, you simply found a vaguely ship-shaped space between rough wooden barrels of cargo, nestled uncomfortably amongst abrasive sacks of grain, fervently hoping the resident population of rats hadn't found them first, or worse, were currently in residence, or curled up miserably against the cold, hard gunwale, using your own perpetually damp, lice-ridden cloak as both an inadequate mattress and an even more inadequate blanket. Comfort, it cannot be stressed enough, was not a primary design feature of Viking longships. Privacy was a laughable, utterly alien fiction. You slept fully clothed, of course, partly for a pathetic illusion of warmth, and partly because the very act of undressing in such exposed, frigid, and public conditions would be an exercise in pointless, self-inflicted masochistic folly. Your nocturnal bedfellows were a lively, uninvited, and remarkably resilient menagerie. The aforementioned rats, grown bold and insolent from long association with seafarers, scurrying brazenly over your sleeping form in the dark, their tiny claws occasionally snagging on your hair or face. Vast, teeming legions of hardy, salt-resistant lice and fleas, treating your woolen garments as a personal, all-inclusive holiday resort, and your skin as a readily available 24-hour self-replenishing buffet. And of course, your charming fellow crewmates, snoring, snorting, coughing, groaning, muttering incoherently in their troubled sleep, and occasionally flailing their limbs wildly in the throes of some vivid, maritime-themed nightmare, all within inches of your already traumatized face, the gentle, rhythmic lapping of waves against the hull, so often romanticized in landlubber poetry, was more often experienced as the aggressive, jarring slap of icy water finding yet another ingenious way to thoroughly soak your inadequate bedding and chill you to the very core of your being. It wasn't home, sweet home. It was home, damp, drafty, and dangerously full of vermin and regret. So, our intrepid trader has somehow managed to consume his grim, unappetizing repast and has settled uneasily into his questionable, vermin-infested patch of damp deck. Surely now, at long last, he can achieve a few precious hours of blissful, uninterrupted, restorative slumber. You continue to be a persistent optimist, dear listener, and it's rather endearing, in a tragically misguided, historically naive sort of way. The very notion that night, or any other designated rest period for that matter, was intended for peaceful, uninterrupted sleep, was a charming, almost whimsical fairy tale, probably told by comfortable, well-fed landlubbers who had never had the distinct displeasure of meeting the North Atlantic in a belligerent mood. Sleep, for a Viking seafarer, was not a right, nor even a privilege. It was a heavily rationed, frequently stolen, and almost invariably inadequate commodity. It was a brief, shallow, fragile, and constantly interrupted affair, snatched guiltily in desperate fits and fleeting starts between seemingly endless bouts of exhausting labor, terrifying emergencies, or sheer, bone-chilling, inescapable physical discomfort. First, and most reliably, there were the watches. Someone at all times absolutely had to be awake, ostensibly alert, or at least as alert as a chronically, profoundly sleep-deprived and miserably cold man could possibly be, to steer the ship, to watch for sudden ominous changes in the weather, to spot potential dangers like submerged rocks, hostile shores, or other, less friendly vessels, and generally to ensure that they didn't all inadvertently sail off the recognized edge of the world, or directly into the gaping, patiently waiting jaws of a colossal sea monster. Standing watch on a cold, dark, violently pitching deck, with the wind howling like a legion of damned souls in your ears and icy, stinging spray relentlessly soaking you to the bone, was a profoundly lonely, intensely miserable, and often deeply terrifying experience. Your eyelids would feel as if they were lined with coarse sand and held open with fish hooks. Your mind, starved of rest, would play cruel tricks on you, conjuring phantom shapes in the darkness, and every unexpected creak of the ship's timbers, every unusually large splash of a rogue wave against the hull, could sound like the immediate prelude to certain, watery doom. Then there were the emergencies, which, with depressing, almost predictable regularity, seemed to occur at the most inconvenient and sleep-deprived moments. The sudden dreaded cry of "all hands on deck," or its Norse equivalent, probably something far more guttural and alarming, would shatter whatever fragile, exhausted peace might have momentarily descended upon the ship, day or night, with no regard for sleep schedules or human frailty. A sudden, violent squall could materialize out of nowhere, demanding frantic, desperate sail handling by every available man. A newly sprung, gushing leak in the hull would require immediate, relentless, desperate bailing by all hands to prevent the ship from sinking like a stone. A lookout's panicked sighting of a potentially hostile ship on the horizon would necessitate instant battle readiness, with weapons hastily grabbed and shields donned. A man overboard, his desperate cries quickly swallowed by the roar of the wind and waves, would trigger a chaotic, often futile, rescue attempt. Sleep schedules, personal comfort, and general exhaustion were utterly irrelevant in the face of such immediate, existential threats. You simply tumbled out of your damp, inadequate coverings, your mind still thick and fogged with exhaustion, and lurched blindly into action. Because failure to do so, or even a moment's hesitation, could very well mean a swift and unpleasant death for everyone on board. And even if, by some extraordinary miracle, you weren't currently on watch and no immediate life-threatening crisis was actively unfolding, the sheer, unrelenting physical discomfort of your surroundings often made deep, restorative slumber an impossible, almost laughable dream. The constant, unpredictable, violent motion of the ship, the gnawing, penetrating cold that seeped into your very bones and could never be entirely banished, the inescapable, clinging dampness that permeated everything you wore and touched, the incessant, maddening itching from your lice-ridden woolen clothes, the cacophonous chorus of snores, coughs, groans, and nightmare-induced shouts from your closely packed companions, the persistent, throbbing aching of your overworked, exhausted muscles. All of these delightful factors, and more, conspired tirelessly to keep you hovering in a miserable, frustrating twilight state somewhere between profound exhaustion and tortured, fitful wakefulness. The cumulative long-term effect of this chronic, severe sleep deprivation was, needless to say, profound and debilitating. It wasn't just about feeling a bit tired or groggy in the morning. It was about a deep, pervasive, cellular weariness that insidiously impaired judgment, dramatically slowed reflexes, dangerously shortened tempers, and probably contributed significantly to a general ship-wide atmosphere of bleak, irritable, simmering despondency. It's a genuine wonder they didn't all just give up in collective despair and steer directly into the nearest convenient rock out of sheer, exhausted, world-weary apathy. For the Viking trader, sleep wasn't a gentle, poetic knitting up of the raveled sleeve of care. It was a tattered, inadequate, frequently snatched rag thrown hastily and ineffectually over a gaping, bleeding wound of terminal fatigue. So, our intrepid Viking trader endures a life of unremitting, back-breaking toil, appalling levels of discomfort, constant nerve-shredding danger, and the questionable, often irritating companionship of his fellow sufferers, all while subsisting on a diet that would make a particularly hardened and unfussy goat weep with despair. Surely you might reasonably think, for all this selfless, heroic dedication to the noble and vital cause of interregional commerce, he was handsomely, even extravagantly, rewarded? Surely the satisfying clinking of silver coins in his worn leather pouch was a symphony sweet enough to occasionally drown out the haunting memory of screaming gales, splintering oars, and the desperate cries of drowning men? One would certainly hope so. But hope, as we've painstakingly established throughout this narrative, was a rather flimsy, easily devalued currency in the brutal, unforgiving North Atlantic economy of suffering. The stark economic realities for the average Viking longship trader were, more often than not, as grim, as cold, and as unyielding as a Lofoten winter storm. The concept of a regular, fixed, predictable salary or wage as we modern cubicle dwellers understand it was largely, if not entirely, alien to his world. Instead, many Viking trading voyages, especially those undertaken by independent crews or smaller associations, operated on a share system, a kind of maritime cooperative or partnership known rather charmingly as a phalag. This sounds rather equitable, almost idyllic on the surface, doesn't it? Fellowship, partnership, all very cozy, communal, and egalitarian. Each man, from the lofty, all-powerful skipper down to the lowliest, most expendable deckhand or ship's boy, was theoretically entitled to a pre-agreed portion or share of the voyage's eventual profits. If, and this is a very large, very significant if, any such profits actually materialized at the end of the arduous, perilous venture. Naturally, the ship owner, who might also be the skipper himself, or increasingly a wealthy land-based investor who wouldn't dream of setting foot on a leaky boat, would claim the lion's share of any profits for the considerable risk of providing the expensive vessel and perhaps the initial cargo or operating capital. The skipper for his immense responsibility, his supposed navigational skills, or sometimes his sheer dumb luck, and his often tyrannical leadership, would take another substantial cut right off the top. What little remained after these primary stakeholders had filled their coffers was then, in theory, divided amongst the rest of the crew. These individual shares would vary considerably based on a man's skill, his experience, his specific role on the ship. A master carpenter or a fearsome warrior hired for protection would get more than a mere oarsman, and perhaps not insignificantly, on how much the skipper happened to like you or dislike you that particular week. This inherently precarious system meant that your payday, your reward for months of misery, was entirely terrifyingly dependent on the voyage being deemed a success. This required the cargo to be delivered reasonably intact and undamaged, the goods to be traded profitably in some distant, often hostile market, and crucially, the ship itself to be returned to its home port in more or less one piece. A sudden violent storm that irretrievably damaged the precious merchandise, a determined pirate attack that significantly lightened the load and possibly your crew numbers, a disastrous navigational miscalculation that led you to a market already glutted with your particular wares, or simply a prolonged, inexplicable run of bad luck, could mean that all your weeks or months of intense suffering, your frostbitten fingers and aching back, amounted to precisely nothing. Zilch. Nada. Or worse, far worse, you could end up significantly in debt to the skipper or the ship owner if serious losses were incurred. or if you were unfortunate enough to be deemed personally responsible for some costly mishap or damage. The charming concept of profit sharing had a rather cruel, unspoken twin brother called loss sharing, and it rarely, if ever, seemed to share those losses upwards towards the wealthier investors. Even when a voyage was officially declared successful, the individual crewman's resulting share might be modest at best, often paid out not in gleaming, easily spendable silver coins, but in kind, that is, a physical portion of the traded goods themselves. So, after months spent risking your life to haul valuable walrus tusks from the icy horrors of Greenland, your grand, eagerly anticipated reward might be one slightly chipped walrus tusk, or perhaps a few lengths of dubious quality, unfashionably colored Frisian cloth, or maybe just an extra, grudgingly given ration of slightly less rank, slightly less salty, dried fish. This was all well and good if you happened to have an immediate personal use for a walrus tusk, or if you could easily and profitably trade it onward in your home village. But it wasn't always the readily spendable, life-improving wealth one might have fantasized about during those long, cold nights at sea. Converting a miscellaneous assortment of traded goods into actual food for your family, or repairs for your leaky hut, often involved yet another complex and potentially disadvantageous series of bartering transactions. And then, of course, there were the deductions. Oh, the glorious, imaginative, endlessly inventive, and entirely arbitrary deductions from your meager share. Lost a piece of the ship's gear, however minor? That's coming straight out of your share, with a hefty surcharge for inconvenience. Perceived by the skipper to be slacking in your duties, or not pulling your oar with sufficient enthusiasm? Instant deduction. Accidentally spilled some of the skipper's precious watered-down ale during a particularly violent lurch of the ship? You guessed it. Deduction. Looked at the merchant's prize-hunting falcon in a manner that he, in his infinite wisdom, deemed disrespectful or unlucky? Believe it or not, that could very well be another deduction. The skipper was often the sole judge, jury, executioner, and chief financial officer, and his unique accounting practices were rarely transparent, seldom equitable, and certainly not subject to any form of appeal or independent audit. So, for the common Viking trader, it was a life of perpetual economic feast or famine, but with famine, or at least severe rationing, being by far the more frequent and reliable dinner guest. A rare, unbroken run of exceptionally good, profitable voyages might, just might, allow a particularly skilled, lucky, and frugal trader to slowly accumulate a small amount of tangible wealth, perhaps enough to buy a small, rocky patch of undesirable farmland, invest in his own fractional share of an even older, leakier ship, or maybe just afford a slightly better quality axe. But one truly disastrous trip, one catastrophic shipwreck in a nameless storm, one particularly efficient and bloodthirsty pirate crew, could mercilessly wipe out years of hard-won, painfully accumulated gains in a single, terrifying instant, leaving him with absolutely nothing but his scars, his recurring nightmares, and a profound, abiding sense of bitterness and injustice. It was less a structured career path with a clear trajectory for advancement, and more a high-stakes, saltwater-soaked, emotionally draining gamble, where the house, be it the sea, the skipper, or the system itself, usually had a very firm, unyielding grip on the dice and a marked tendency to win in the long run. There was a grand, almost cosmic, and deeply, profoundly cynical irony deeply embedded in the Viking trader's typical economic situation. Here he was, an undeniably vital, if often unacknowledged, cog in the burgeoning dynamic machinery of the Viking Age economy, a crucial sinew in the strong arm of Norse expansion, trade, and cultural influence. He and his hardy, weather-beaten kind were the intrepid, or perhaps just incredibly desperate and foolhardy, individuals who physically, painstakingly connected the far-flung, often isolated corners of their known world. They braved the icy, storm-tossed horrors of the North Atlantic to link the newly settled shores of Greenland and Iceland with the resource-rich, ancestral lands of Scandinavia. They navigated treacherous coastal waters and ventured up mighty, often hostile, riverine systems to reach the bustling, multicultural emporia of the East. And they regularly plied the turbulent seas between their homelands and the increasingly wary markets of the British Isles and continental Europe. They were the ones who transported the very goods that greased the wheels of power, prestige, and political influence for the ruling elite. They ferried shimmering, coveted silks and exotic, fragrant spices from the distant, almost mythical Orient, acquired, of course, through a long and complex chain of equally adventurous middlemen. They brought fine wines from the vineyards of Francia, gleaming delicate glassware, high-quality weapons, finely crafted pottery, and other manufactured goods that were unavailable in their homelands. They hauled the unique luxury items of the north, soft, valuable furs from forest creatures, dense, carvable walrus ivory from the Arctic, translucent amber from the Baltic shores, and intricately designed, well-crafted jewelry that adorned the timbered halls and the persons of powerful jarls, ambitious kings, and wealthy, influential merchants. They also, just as importantly, transported the essential, life-sustaining bulk commodities that kept society functioning: timber for shipbuilding, fortifications and housing, soapstone for carving into lamps, pots, and weights, stone for querns to grind grain, grain itself to feed hungry, growing settlements, especially in less fertile regions, and wool to clothe them against the biting northern winds. And on occasion, they also transported the most tragic cargo of all: the human chattel, the unfortunate thralls, captured in raids or born into servitude, that formed the unhappy, unwilling bedrock of much ancient labor and agricultural production. Without these hardy, resilient, long-suffering seafarers, these unsung masters of the miserable, perilous voyage, the intricate, vital web of Viking trade routes would have quickly withered and died. The nascent towns and trading posts, from Dublin to Novgorod, would have starved or stagnated. The ambitious chieftains and minor kings would have had far fewer shiny baubles with which to impress their rivals, reward their loyal followers, or buy alliances. And for this absolutely pivotal, foundational role in the entire economic and social fabric of their era, for literally physically hauling a kingdom's, or at least a very powerful jarl's, accumulated wealth and essential supplies across treacherous, monster-infested seas, for being the very lifeblood of this expansive, dynamic network, what was his typical, tangible reward? As we've already seen, it was often little more than barely adequate subsistence rations, a precarious, often disappointing share of uncertain and frequently manipulated profits, and a social status that, while perhaps a marginal step above that of a landless farm laborer or an owned thrall, was still a vast, unbridgeable universe away from the celebrated saga heroes, the land-owning warrior elite, and the powerful, wealthy chieftains whose luxurious, influential lifestyles his back-breaking, life-risking labor directly helped to underwrite and maintain. He was, in many ways, the anonymous, weather-beaten, easily forgotten engine driver of a magnificent gravy train, from which he was permitted only the occasional, grudgingly offered, insignificant crumb. He physically moved mountains of wealth across the known world, yet his own worn leather pouch, more often than not, would have contained little more than a collection of sea lice, a few painful splinters, a lingering smell of fish, and a collection of shattered, improbable dreams of one day, somehow, striking it rich enough to finally escape the relentless tyranny of the sea. The intrinsic value of his service to society was immense, almost incalculable. The value placed upon him as an individual human being was, all too often, tragically, insultingly negligible. As if the inherent, systemic unfairness of the rudimentary pay system and the generally thankless, unappreciated nature of his dangerous job weren't already enough to crush a man's spirit. Our Viking trader's already precarious economic existence was further buffeted, battered, and frequently undermined by a whole host of unpredictable and entirely uncontrollable external factors. He was but a tiny, insignificant, wind-tossed speck, thrashed about not just by the violent waves of the physical ocean, but also by the larger, equally capricious and indifferent currents of regional politics, continental climate shifts, and widespread societal upheaval. The weather, that ever-present, fickle, and often downright malevolent overlord of all maritime endeavors, naturally played a monumental role in his financial fortunes, or lack thereof. A particularly long, harsh, and stormy winter, or a summer season plagued by an unending succession of relentless gales and impenetrable fogs, could easily keep entire fleets of trading ships confined miserably to port for extended profitless periods. This meant no voyages undertaken, no trade conducted, and therefore absolutely no income trickling down to the hungry crews. Entire trading seasons could be effectively lost, leading to widespread economic hardship, desperation, and even starvation for those unfortunate souls who depended entirely on the capricious sea for their meager livelihood. Politics and warfare were constant, unavoidable wildcards in the high-stakes game of Viking Age trade. A bitter, bloody feud erupting between two previously friendly and powerful jarls could suddenly, without warning, close a previously lucrative and reliable trade route, or make a vital port city far too dangerous to approach with valuable cargo. A distant king, deciding on a whim to levy a new, exorbitant, and crippling tax on all traded goods passing through his domain, or suddenly demanding by royal edict that all available ships and able-bodied men be immediately pressed into service for some glorious but probably ill-fated military campaign, a form of involuntary employment that rarely came with generous profit-sharing schemes or adequate compensation for lost trading opportunities, could throw carefully laid, desperately needed commercial plans into complete and utter disarray. Unrest, civil war, or foreign invasion in those distant, exotic lands from which valuable luxury goods originated could instantly dry up essential supplies or send prices soaring to unmanageable levels, making any attempt at profitable trade utterly impossible for months or even years. The general state of regional economies, both at home and abroad, also wielded a massive, often devastating, impact on his fortunes. A severe drought leading to poor harvests or widespread famine in a region he intended to trade with meant that the impoverished local population had little or no surplus agricultural produce to offer in exchange for his goods, and certainly no spare wealth with which to purchase them. Conversely, if everyone in a particular region had an unexpectedly good year producing, say, homespun wool or roughly carved wooden bowls, the local market might become instantly glutted, and the price he could realistically expect to get for his precious cargo of expertly smuggled Irish sheep or beautifully carved Norwegian ale flagons would plummet disastrously. He might arrive after a horrendous, life-threatening voyage, his hold thankfully still full of what he fervently believed to be valuable, desirable merchandise, only to discover to his utter dismay that it was currently worth less than the accumulated barnacles clinging stubbornly to the underside of his weary hull. And then, of course, there was the ever-present, terrifying scourge of piracy and opportunistic raiding, sometimes, ironically enough, engaged in by his own seafaring colleagues on their less commercially focused, more violently entrepreneurial off-days. A particularly bad year for organized, bloodthirsty seaborne marauders operating along critical, unavoidable shipping lanes could make certain voyages prohibitively risky, or at the very least force independent trading ships to band together for mutual protection, traveling in larger, slower, less efficient, and ultimately less profitable convoys. The constant, chilling risk of losing not just your valuable cargo, but also your ship, your freedom, and your very life to these ruthless, ocean-going entrepreneurs of organized violence was an unavoidable factor in every economic calculation, a variable that usually tilted the scales of fortune firmly and often fatally away from the average, hard-working crewman's potential benefit. All these unpredictable, uncontrollable elements, the perceived whims of the often angry gods manifesting as weeks of terrible, ship-smashing weather, the petty ambitions and bloody squabbles of greedy rulers and warlords, the inexplicable booms and devastating busts of distant, interconnected economies, the insatiable predatory instincts of his fellow men, all conspired together in a perfect storm of misfortune to make the Viking trader's financial life a terrifying, nauseating roller coaster ride. But it was a ride where the exhilarating, hopeful uphill climbs towards prosperity were agonizingly rare, tantalizingly short-lived and usually followed by terrifying, stomach-lurching, almost inevitable descents into grinding poverty, crushing debt, and profound, inescapable despair. So, our unfortunate Viking trader has somehow endured the unrelenting physical degradation, the corrosive mental torment, the constant social frustrations, the appalling living conditions that would make a sewer rat consider upgrading, and the profoundly precarious economics of his chosen, or rather, inflicted profession. But perhaps, you might wistfully imagine, after a particularly grueling and perilous voyage, there was a glorious sense of completion, a cherished moment to metaphorically rest on his laurels, such as they were, probably damp, smelling faintly of fish, and offering little actual comfort. A profound, soul-satisfying feeling of job well done now, for a long, peaceful, and well-deserved break from the horrors of the sea. If you are still nodding hopefully along to these optimistic scenarios, dear listener, your capacity for positive thinking is truly a thing of wonder, a rare and precious, if somewhat historically naive, bloom in the vast arid desert of documented human despair. For the average Viking trader, the very concept of finished, of true cessation, was largely an illusion, a cruel, shimmering mirage on an endless, gray, and unforgiving horizon of perpetual toil. The to-do list for our weary, waterlogged wanderer wasn't a neat series of discrete tasks leading to a final, satisfying, triumphant checkmark. It was more akin to a cursed runic inscription carved onto the surface of a Mobius strip, reading simply, and with chilling monotony, suffer, sail, trade, repair, repeat, infinitely, or until drowned. One arduous journey didn't so much conclude as it merely and seamlessly bled into the frantic, exhausting preparations for the next. Arrive at a bustling, chaotic, and probably hostile port, let's say Jorvik, or perhaps Dublin, after a charmingly nauseating and bone-chilling trip across the North Sea from Norway. And what happens next? Is it a ticker tape parade and a key to the city? Unlikely. More probable is a brief, frenetic, and highly stressful period of unloading the current cargo of misery, perhaps heavy timber, fragrant furs, or blocks of soapstone, haggling fiercely with untrustworthy, sharp-eyed merchants who would happily sell their own grandmothers for a bent copper coin, and almost certainly getting comprehensively cheated on the prevailing exchange rate for goods or silver. Then, almost before the unfamiliar, longed-for scent of dry land and wood smoke has fully displaced the pervasive, clinging aroma of bilge water and old fish in your protesting nostrils, it's immediately time to begin the equally laborious process of loading the next consignment of potential misery. Perhaps Irish wool destined to become scratchy Viking tunics, live and understandably agitated sheep, hides of dubious quality, and perhaps some equally disgruntled and unwilling thralls, for the inevitable voyage back to the homeland, or onwards to the icy shores of Iceland, or wherever else the skipper's questionable ambitions, the merchant's pressing needs, or the inscrutable whims of fate dictated. The ship itself, that leaky, creaking, groaning partner in all their suffering, was a perpetual, never-ending project, a wooden Sisyphus compelling them to push an enormous boulder of endless, frustrating repairs up a very steep, very slippery, and ultimately insurmountable hill. You'd spend days, exhausted and freezing, patching the myriad leaks that had plagued you relentlessly on the last voyage, using sticky tar, animal hair, and fervent curses, only for new, entirely different leaks to cheerfully, almost mockingly, announce their unwelcome presence with fresh, insidious trickles of icy seawater as soon as you hit the open, unforgiving sea once more. You'd painstakingly mend the sail that was savagely torn to ribbons in the last unexpected gale, knowing with a grim, bone-deep certainty that the next storm was probably already brewing malevolently just over the horizon, eager to test your hasty stitching and your dwindling patience. Oars that had splintered or snapped under strain would be replaced, or crudely repaired. Rigging that had stretched or frayed would be tightened or laboriously spliced. The hull itself would need to be periodically scraped free of clinging seaweed and colonies of surprisingly resilient barnacles. A truly delightful and aromatic task, usually involving much awkward, back-breaking labor, the ingestion of many small marine organisms, and a profound sense of existential pointlessness, all in a never-ending, soul-destroying cycle of inevitable deterioration and reluctant, temporary restoration. There was no true, lasting completion, no definitive point at which our Viking trader could sigh with relief and legitimately say, "There, that's finally done for good." Each exhausting task successfully completed was merely the necessary, unavoidable precondition for the next equally exhausting task to begin. Each anxiously awaited landfall was not an arrival at a final, restful destination, but merely a temporary, often chaotic waypoint in an unending, wearying circuit of maritime labor and commercial exchange. The brief, precious moments spent ashore, far from being periods of recuperation and leisure, were often entirely consumed by the urgent need to resupply the ship with food, water, and essential gear, by the frantic scramble to seek out and secure new cargo for the next leg of the journey, or by engaging in the kind of boisterous, often violent, alcohol-fueled relaxation in dubious dockside taverns that frequently led to fresh, painful injuries, the acquisition of new, dangerous enemies, or a significantly, depressingly lighter coin purse. All of which, ironically, only served to reinforce the pressing necessity of undertaking the next perilous voyage as soon as humanly possible. It was a relentless, churning, inescapable cycle, as predictable in its misery, and as impossible to halt, as the eternal, indifferent tides themselves. But why, you might reasonably ask, wiping a sympathetic tear from your eye with the corner of your comfortably laundered sleeve, did he continue this agonizing charade? Why not simply hang up his, probably hopelessly mildewed and permanently fish-scented, sea cloak once and for all, metaphorically trade his heavy, blister-inducing oar for a sturdy plowshare, and settle down to a quiet, uneventful, land-based life of tending a few hardy goats on some windswept, marginal Norwegian hillside? A tempting, idyllic thought, perhaps, for those of us viewing his plight from the comfortable distance of a millennium, but it's a thought that largely ignores the brutal, constraining realities of his era and the severely limited options available to him. Our Viking trader was trapped, not just by the exhausting, cyclical nature of his specific work, but by the very unforgiving structure of his society and the narrowly defined, almost predetermined horizons of his world. He was a cog, not just in the ship's daily miserable routine, but in the grand, implacable, and often cruel machine of his time. What, realistically, were his alternatives? For a man born and bred to the sea, whose primary, hard-won skills involved navigating by the subtle feel of the wind on his face and the run of the current beneath his hull, understanding the treacherous moods of the capricious ocean, and enduring almost unimaginable levels of physical hardship and psychological stress, without, usually, openly weeping or succumbing to madness. What other viable career paths truly beckoned? Farming in much of Scandinavia, particularly in the coastal regions from which many seafarers hailed, was an incredibly hardscrabble, often thankless existence on poor, rocky, marginal land. It was frequently just as precarious and subject to the whims of nature as life at sea, and it came with considerably less chance, however vanishingly slim, of a sudden life-altering windfall from a lucky trade or a plundered cargo. Becoming a skilled artisan, such as a blacksmith or a carpenter, required specialized knowledge, a long and often costly apprenticeship, which he likely couldn't afford, and access to tools and capital that were far beyond his reach. The life of a professional warrior in a chieftain's herd or household retinue might have seemed more glamorous from afar, imbued with the promise of glory and plunder so beloved of the Skalds. But in reality, it was often just as dangerous, if not more so, than trading, was paid erratically, if at all, beyond basic keep and a share of any loot. and still involved long, arduous periods away from home, frequently suffering the very same miseries aboard longships on raiding expeditions. The sea, for all its manifest cruelty, its constant threats, and its profound discomforts, was what he knew. It was, in a deeply twisted and ironic way, his inescapable heritage and a core part of his rugged, weather-beaten identity. His community, his felag, was one of seafarers. His social standing, such as it was inextricably tied to his role as a trader, a man who dared to venture forth into the unknown, and, against all odds, sometimes brought back valuable goods, and hopefully, for his backers, some profit. To abandon the sea entirely might well have meant abandoning his recognized place in that tight-knit, if harsh world, potentially becoming an outcast, a dependent, a man without purpose or respect. The famed freedom of the Viking, that romanticized ability to roam the wide seas at will, was largely an illusion, a cruel joke for those like our trader, who depended utterly on those very seas for their daily, meager bread. It wasn't the liberating freedom of genuine choice. It was more akin to the desperate, instinctual freedom of the hungry seagull, compelled by its empty belly and the cries of its starving chicks, to relentlessly follow the fishing boats, hoping for a discarded scrap. He was bound by invisible chains to the established rhythm of the trade routes, to the fluctuating demands of the merchants who financed the voyages, to the seasonal availability of certain goods, and above all, to the relentless, gnawing, internal need to earn enough to survive and to support his family until the next inevitable, perilous voyage. The hamster wheel he ran upon might have been vast, ocean-going, and occasionally offered a change of scenery, but it was a hamster wheel nonetheless, a closed loop of toil and anxiety, and there were precious few viable exits for a creature like him, born and conditioned to its relentless turning. He sailed because he had to sail, because the alternative, for many in his position, was often slow starvation, abject destitution, or a life even more circumscribed, bleak, and devoid of hope. The distant, beckoning horizon offered not boundless opportunity and thrilling adventure, but merely the grim, predictable promise of the next iteration of the same inescapable, wearying grind. Now, it would be a profound insult to the pervasive, soul-deep misery of our Viking trader's precarious existence to blithely suggest that his life contained anything remotely approaching what a modern, comfortably ensconced, emotionally literate individual might readily recognize as joy, happiness, or personal fulfillment. Such complex, nuanced concepts were likely as alien and inaccessible to him as a sun-drenched, peaceful tropical beach with gently swaying palm trees and readily available, non-alcoholic cocktails. Yet even in the deepest, darkest, most waterlogged and despairing pit of daily grinding suffering, the human spirit, that stubborn, often infuriatingly resilient and fundamentally irrational weed, can sometimes, against all odds, find the tiniest, most improbable, almost invisible crack of bleak, fractured light. It might stumble upon a microscopic, unexpected affirmation of its continued, unwelcome, yet undeniably persistent existence. These weren't moments of genuine joy, you understand. They were more akin to discovering a single, slightly less rotten, marginally less maggot-infested patch on an otherwise entirely putrescent and inedible apple. A fleeting, almost imperceptible improvement in an overwhelmingly grim situation that nonetheless registered, for a brief second, as not entirely awful. Perhaps there was a grim, fleeting flicker of purely professional pride, a deeply buried, almost extinguished spark of genuine satisfaction, when he and his equally exhausted crew, through a combination of hard-won skill, sheer dumb luck, and an almost superhuman display of bloody-minded endurance, managed to successfully navigate the ship through a horrendous, ship-killing storm that by all rights and historical precedents should have sent them directly to the bottom of the sea to provide a banquet for the crabs and other assorted scavengers. That transcendent moment when the wind finally, grudgingly, began to ease, when the mountainous waves began to slowly, reluctantly subside, and they all gradually realized, with a dawning, incredulous sense of profound disbelief, that they were all still somehow alive, and the battered ship, miraculously, was still mostly afloat. That wasn't happiness, not by a long shot, but it was a profound, visceral, almost spiritual relief that tasted, for a few precious moments, almost as good, and certainly far more real. Or consider the simple, uncomplicated, almost primal feeling of setting foot on solid, unmoving, blessed land, after weeks or even months of being relentlessly tossed about like a forgotten toy on the vast, indifferent, and perpetually agitated breast of the ocean. The earth not lurching and swaying violently beneath your feet with every step. The glorious, forgotten ability to walk more than 10 paces in a relatively straight line without cannoning into a gunwale, a mast, or another equally unsteady crewmate. These were sensations so exquisitely alien, so long forgotten, they bordered on the truly, unimaginably luxurious. Again, this wasn't joy as we understand it, but it was a temporary, blissful, deeply appreciated reprieve from a very specific, very prolonged, and very unpleasant kind of physical torment. There might have been, on rare occasions, a fleeting, internal sense of quiet competence when a particularly difficult or dangerous ship-handling maneuver was executed perfectly under immense pressure, perhaps beaching the heavy, unwieldy longship smoothly and safely in a tricky, pounding surf, or cleverly evading a larger, faster, and clearly suspicious-looking vessel in poor visibility, with a display of brilliant, seat-of-the-pants sailing. No one would likely offer verbal praise or tangible reward. Such things were not the Viking way for everyday competence. But he knew. He knew he hadn't messed it up, that his skill had made a difference, and that small internal knowledge might offer a sliver of grim self-respect. Occasionally, just often enough to prevent total, crushing despair, a trade might go unexpectedly, almost miraculously, well. He might end up with a sliver more profit, a slightly better quality, or more desirable item in exchange for his goods than he had realistically dared to hope for. This minor windfall wouldn't make him rich, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it might mean an extra small, cherished treat for his waiting family back home. A slightly less meager winter, or one less night spent wide awake, worrying about impending starvation or crippling debt. And then, of course, there was the laughter. Not the gentle, warm, life-affirming laughter of genuine contentment or shared joy, but the harsh, barking, often cruel and cynical gallows humor shared exclusively with his fellow sufferers, his brothers in maritime misery. A joke so dark, so inappropriate, so deeply offensive that it would make a modern-day sensitivity counselor spontaneously combust. A cutting, sarcastic comment about the skipper's latest demonstrably idiotic decision. Always muttered just out of his direct earshot, of course, unless the speaker possessed a death wish. A shared, weary, eloquent eye roll at the sheer, bloody, inescapable absurdity of their collective wretched situation. These weren't truly expressions of happiness, not in the conventional sense, but they were vital, life-affirming moments of human connection, raw, unvarnished acknowledgments that they were all, quite literally, in the same stinking, leaking, miserable boat together. They were the scattered, elusive fleas of grim, fleeting satisfaction, found occasionally, if one looked very hard, hopping unexpectedly in an otherwise thoroughly mange-ridden, flea-bitten, and generally unpleasant existence. Tiny, almost imperceptible affirmations that even in the deepest, darkest pits of misery, life, in its most stubborn, infuriating, and unglamorous form, somehow inexplicably persisted. Time, like the relentless, grinding tide or a particularly stubborn creditor, waits for no man, not even a hardy, if increasingly creaky and weather-beaten, Viking trader. As the relentless succession of icy winters etched ever deeper lines onto his already careworn face, and the constant salt spray bleached more of the remaining color from his thinning, windswept hair, our long-suffering trader would inevitably, and with considerable dread, face the unwelcome prospect of his own declining strength, his failing senses, and the grim, unavoidable question of who would take up the heavy, unforgiving oar, or rather, the entire crushing burden of this miserable existence that he would eventually, and with great reluctance, be forced to lay down. More often than not, tragically, the answer was standing right beside him, a younger, greener, more tragically naive version of his former self. His son. You see, our trader didn't exactly choose this life of unremitting maritime misery with a song in his heart and a spring in his step, and it's a fairly safe bet that if your son had any genuine uncoerced say in the matter, which in that hierarchical and unforgiving society he almost certainly didn't, neither would he. But choices, particularly comfortable or desirable ones, were rare and expensive luxuries, commodities few families in their precarious position could ever realistically afford, as your own once formidable strength began its slow, undeniable, and deeply depressing wane, as the persistent aches in your joints transitioned from an occasional unwelcome visitor into a constant, grinding, inseparable companion. You'd look at your boy, perhaps a young lad of 10 or 12 harsh winters, his frame still lanky, awkward, and unformed, his eyes wide with a volatile, confusing mixture of youthful, ignorant awe for his seafaring father, and a burgeoning, instinctual apprehension for the life that clearly awaited him. And a complex, incredibly bitter brew of conflicting emotions would churn like bilge water in your weary gut. There was grim, undeniable, pragmatic necessity, of course. Another pair of hands, however small, clumsy, and initially unskilled, was increasingly vital to the family's tenuous thread of survival. Another body, however reluctant, was needed to contribute to the never-ending, back-breaking labor of the ship during voyages, or to help work the small, unproductive patch of land that laughably passed for a farm back home. But beneath that cold, hard layer of practicality, there might have been, on occasion, a fleeting, treacherous flicker of something almost resembling paternal pride, a momentary warmth quickly and invariably extinguished by an overwhelming wave of profound, corrosive, soul-searing guilt. You knew, with a chilling certainty that cut deeper than any Arctic wind, that you were, in effect, personally shackling him to the very same leaking, miserable, death-trap barge of a life that you yourself had so bitterly, and for so long, endured. You were consciously, deliberately passing on, not a proud, enriching legacy of thrilling adventure and well-earned prosperity, but an almost certain inheritance of perpetually aching backs, permanently frostbitten extremities, chronic malnutrition, and the ever-present lurking threat of a cold, lonely, watery grave. It was less a torch of glory and more a baton of suffering. So, you'd teach him the grim necessities of the trade, just as your own equally conflicted, equally trapped father had once taught you, with a barrage of gruff, impatient commands, sharp, stinging cuffs for clumsiness or inattention, and the relentless, mind-numbing drill of repetitive, utterly exhausting, and often dangerous tasks. You'd bark at him like a surly old sea dog when he inevitably fumbled a crucial knot in a critical moment, when he shivered too obviously and pathetically in the biting cold, a sign of weakness you couldn't afford to tolerate, in him or yourself, when his young, underdeveloped arms faltered and failed at the heavy, demanding oar. You'd watch, with a strange, detached kind of pain, as his initial, boyish, saga-fueled enthusiasm for the supposed adventure of the sea slowly, inexorably curdled into a weary, disillusioned resignation. This happened as the brutal, unvarnished reality of the relentless work, the inescapable cold, the gnawing hunger, the constant dampness, and the ever-present underlying fear began to relentlessly sink into his young, impressionable mind. You'd recognize, with a sickening lurch of your stomach, your own long-lost youth mirrored in his slowly clouding eyes. That same dawning, dreadful, world-wearying understanding that had once, so many bitter years ago, irrevocably tainted your own innocent view of the world. The bleak, soul-crushing realization that this was his glorious, inescapable inheritance, his predetermined, unalterable destiny. Perhaps in the darkest, most desperate hours of a howling, ship-tossing, stormy night, when you mistakenly thought he was asleep, huddled miserably beside you for a pathetic scrap of shared warmth, you might look at his small, vulnerable, shivering form and feel a sudden, unexpected pang of something akin to genuine tenderness. A desperate, unspoken, utterly futile wish that you could somehow offer him something, anything, better than this wretched, watery purgatory. But then the ship would lurch violently. A colossal wave would crash thunderously over the bow, drenching you both anew in freezing, life-sapping water. And the fleeting moment of paternal softness would be instantly gone, ruthlessly swallowed by the immediate, pressing, all-consuming need for collective survival. In those moments, you were not just his father. You were, by grim necessity, his first and harshest and most effective taskmaster in the brutal, unforgiving open-air school of maritime suffering. You were, with a heavy heart and calloused hands, actively, knowingly perpetuating the miserable cycle, not out of inherent malice or a sadistic desire to see him suffer, but because that wretched cycle was all you truly knew, and, in your bleak experience, all the uncaring world seemed prepared to offer to men of your station. The North Atlantic, like a cruel, implacable, and meticulously patient moneylender, always collects its outstanding debts in the end. And the primary currency it relentlessly, mercilessly demanded from our aging Viking trader was his own flesh and blood, his waning strength, his fading vitality, all paid out in painful, daily, almost imperceptible installments over decades of unrelenting, thankless service. Eventually, inevitably, the biological account would run dry. The body, so long and so cruelly abused, so consistently overdrawn on its reserves of resilience, would finally, with little ceremony, begin to issue its unequivocal, non-negotiable notice of foreclosure. That chronic hacking cough, once just an annoying seasonal winter companion, now rattled his chest with a deeper, more persistent, more ominous menace, making every single indrawn breath a conscious, laborious, and often painful effort. The pervasive arthritis that had long plagued his protesting joints now felt less like a dull, familiar ache and more like sharp shards of jagged ice grinding relentlessly in his knees, his hips, his shoulders, and especially his gnarled, swollen knuckles. It made the simple, once automatic act of gripping an oar, hauling a rope, or climbing a slippery, ice-slicked rigging ladder an exercise in pure, white-hot, teeth-clenching agony. His eyesight, once keen enough to spot a distant, approaching sail on the horizon, or a subtle, telltale change in the water's color that might indicate shallows or a shift in current, would inevitably grow dim, hazy, and clouded. This slow decay turned the already challenging, high-stakes art of navigation into a terrifying, potentially lethal game of increasingly blind guesswork, and rendered him a dangerous liability at the crucial steering oar during critical moments. His hearing, progressively dulled by uncounted years of exposure to the deafening roar of gale-force winds and the thunderous crash of breaking waves, would start to miss crucial, softly spoken commands, or the subtle, ominous groaning warnings of a dangerously straining mast or a parting rope. The younger men on the crew, fresh-faced, cocky, and brimming with the ignorant, boundless resilience of youth, perhaps now including his own son, fully grown into his inherited role of maritime misery, would begin to noticeably, effortlessly outpace him in every task. They could haul on the heavy ropes with more explosive vigor, endure the biting, numbing cold with less visible complaint, row for longer, more punishing stretches without any apparent faltering. He would start to see the skipper's appraising gaze, once perhaps tinged with a grudging respect for his experience and seamanship, now pass coolly over him with a new, discomfiting kind of assessment. The cold, detached, calculating look of a man evaluating a worn-out, increasingly unreliable, and ultimately disposable tool. There was precious little room for sentimentality in this brutal, pragmatic world. No gold-plated sundial for long and loyal service at sea. There was no pension plan, no early retirement package, no state-sponsored, comfortably heated Valhalla for a superannuated, broken-down Viking trader, when you could no longer effectively pull your considerable weight on the oar bench. When your slowing reflexes, your dimming vision, and your failing senses made you more of a dangerous hindrance than a valued help to the efficient operation and safety of the ship. You simply became redundant, obsolete. A mouth to feed without the strong hands and sound body to fully earn your keep. If you were exceptionally lucky, you had a supportive family, a still living wife, grown children with a sense of duty or perhaps even affection, willing and able to support you in your declining, unproductive years. This might mean being allowed to potter about a small, windswept farm, offering mostly unwanted advice gleaned from a lifetime of hardship, and endlessly recounting increasingly embellished tales of past maritime miseries and near-death experiences that no one, frankly, really wanted to hear anymore. You might sit hunched by the smoky fire in the longhouse, your days now filled with mending fishing nets with trembling, arthritic fingers, a pale, stooped ghost of your former seafaring self, tolerated perhaps, but largely and painfully useless. If you were less fortunate, or if your family was too poor, too burdened themselves, or simply too callous to care for an unproductive elder, your end could be far bleaker, far more ignominious. You might be reduced to begging for scraps in the very ports you once sailed into with relative pride, relying on the grudging charity of a community that itself had little enough to spare. Or you might simply fade away quietly in some forgotten, drafty corner, another anonymous piece of human driftwood, worn smooth and then broken by the relentless sea, finally cast up and abandoned on the inhospitable, uncaring shores of old age and terminal infirmity. The sea, which had been your harsh, demanding master, your constant, challenging companion, and your reluctant, stingy provider for so many arduous years, had absolutely no further use for you once your strength was finally spent. It offered no gentle retirement, no quiet harbor, only a cold, final, indifferent dismissal. In the unforgiving arithmetic of Viking Age survival, the strong survived and sometimes prospered. The weak perished quickly, and the old just got out of the way one way or another. So, our Viking trader, or at least the archetypal figure we've painstakingly constructed from centuries of cold winds, salty spray, and historical neglect, fades into the cold, indifferent mists of the past. His body, broken by years of relentless toil and exposure, likely found its final resting place in some forgotten coastal grave, unmarked save perhaps by a rough, unlettered stone, or the ceaseless, mournful sigh of the wind over a lonely, windswept fjord. A bleak end to an undeniably bleak life. It's easy, perhaps too easy for us, cushioned by the comforts of modernity, to dismiss him as just another anonymous, forgotten sufferer in a brutal, unforgiving age, a mere footnote in a grand, sweeping saga that primarily celebrates the flamboyant, axe-wielding violence of warrior kings, the cunning of powerful jarls, and the daring, often mythical, raids of dragon-proud fleets. But to do so, to relegate him to the dusty, unvisited archives of forgotten lives, would be to miss the quiet, almost invisible, yet profoundly crucial and indispensable importance of his harsh existence. The great chieftains and jarls whose names echo down to us from runestones, sagas, and the chronicles of their terrified victims, indeed raised their mighty timbered halls, fought their glorious bloody battles, and accumulated their glittering hoards of plundered silver and exotic gold. Their sagas are still sung, their heroic or villainous deeds remembered, or at least creatively embellished and hotly debated by historians. Yet beneath the imposing shadow of every high seat, undergirding every boastful alliterative verse of every epic poem, lay the unrecorded, uncomplaining sweat, the strained, aching sinew, and the relentless, monotonous, often soul-destroying toil of countless anonymous, expendable men like our Viking Longship trader. He wore no gilded ornate helmet to impress his foes, wielded no legendary named sword in famous, history-altering battles, though he likely had to defend his own miserable life and his master's cargo, often enough with a rusty, utilitarian axe or a simple sayax. His frequent, perilous voyages were not typically undertaken for the abstract pursuit of glory, the thrill of discovery, or the establishment of a glorious, lasting empire, but for the far more mundane, yet utterly essential business of moving goods: timber, furs, hides, grain, pottery, even people, from where they were plentiful or simply available, to where they were scarce or desired, or could fetch a slightly better price. Yet without his relentless, often entirely thankless, frequently terrifying, and invariably uncomfortable labor, the granaries of nascent Norse settlements in places like Reykjavik, Dublin, or York would have been significantly emptier. The looms in distant Norwegian longhouses would have been quieter, lacking the fine wool from Irish or English sheep. The hordes of gleaming Arab silver, so prized by Viking leaders as a measure of wealth and status, would have been considerably smaller and harder to acquire. The very sinews of the Viking Age, its surprisingly far-flung and complex trade networks, its burgeoning multicultural towns and trading emporia, its remarkable ability to project power, influence, and colonists across vast, inhospitable oceanic distances, depended utterly and absolutely on the unsung courage, the almost superhuman endurance, and the sheer, bloody-minded, stubborn persistence of these largely forgotten merchant mariners. He was the unseen, uncelebrated ant, laboring tirelessly, often in darkness and danger, beneath the imposing, sun-gilded obelisk of recorded Viking history. He was one of the countless, nameless, forgotten individuals whose collective, agonizing effort formed the very gritty, unglamorous foundation upon which the more celebrated, more visible, and far more comfortable achievements of his era were ultimately built. No statues were ever raised in his specific honor. No skalds were commissioned to compose stirring, memorable lays to commemorate his consistently successful delivery of a cargo of slightly damaged pottery, or his uncanny ability to find his way through fog that would baffle a modern GPS. His name, if it was ever more than a quickly forgotten grunt of acknowledgement from a preoccupied skipper, or a notation on a manifest that has long since turned to dust, has long since dissolved into the mutable wind and the restless waves, as ephemeral and untraceable as the momentary foam on a breaking winter sea. His individual struggles, his private unspoken tragedies, his rare fleeting moments of grim internal satisfaction, all are lost to us now, irretrievably swallowed by the vast, indifferent, echoing silence of the unrecorded past. Yet his legacy, and that of his countless anonymous colleagues, is everywhere around us, hidden in plain sight, subtly, almost invisibly, woven into the very fabric of the early medieval world, and by extension, our own. It's there in the faint archaeological traces of Norse settlements discovered in the harsh landscapes of Iceland, the even harsher climes of Greenland, and even, for a fleeting, tantalizing moment, on the distant shores of North America, remote, precarious outposts established and sustained against overwhelming odds by the tenuous, fraying lifeline of these very trading ships. It's there in the surprising scatter of Arab dirhams and Byzantine silks found in Scandinavian burial hoards, tangible testament to the astonishing, almost unbelievable reach of their commercial enterprises. It's there in the loanwords that passed like currency between disparate languages, in the artistic motifs and craftsmanship techniques that spread slowly from one culture to another, in the very DNA that mingled and mixed in the bustling, cosmopolitan port towns and the remote, isolated coastal farms that dotted the Viking world. These traders, in their smelly, leaky, overcrowded longships, were far more than just simple haulers of mundane or luxury goods. They were, often entirely unwittingly, crucial vectors of profound cultural exchange. They carried not just furs and walrus, ivory, timber and slaves, but also new ideas, innovative technologies, unfamiliar beliefs, different ways of seeing the world, and yes, almost certainly, a fair few unwelcome and devastating diseases too. They didn't just passively witness history from the choppy, windswept deck of their constantly moving vessel. They actively, physically moved it. They connected its disparate, often warring parts, and they helped, in their own small, painful, unacknowledged way, to shape its future course in ways they could never have fully comprehended or possibly intended. They were the anonymous, vital current, the essential motive force that, drip by agonizing, freezing drip, allowed the scattered, isolated fragments of their known world to slowly, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully, coalesce, interact, and ultimately transform. They didn't just build trade routes across treacherous seas. They helped, brick by painful brick, to build the interconnected, increasingly complex world that would inevitably follow their wake. So, the next time you marvel at the sagas of the daring Viking explorers, the legendary exploits of the fierce berserker warriors, or the cunning machinations of the powerful kings and queens who defined that tumultuous and transformative era, please spare a fleeting thought for the forgotten, unnamed, perpetually uncomfortable Viking longship trader. He sought no lasting glory, and by and large received absolutely none, at least not in the grand, sweeping, hero-worshipping annals of popular history. His personal story is not one of triumphant military conquest or glorious noble sacrifice in a shield wall, but one of relentless, grinding endurance, of quiet, desperate competence in the leering face of overwhelming, often terrifying odds, and of a profound, bone-deep, almost unimaginable weariness that settled into his very soul. Yet, in his unceasing, thankless labor, in his stubborn, almost irrational refusal to be utterly defeated by the merciless elements, the greed of others, or the sheer bloody awfulness of his daily lot, in his grim, dogged determination to simply make one more voyage, deliver one more cargo, and perhaps, if the gods were inexplicably kind, see his family one more time before he died. He was so much more than just a long-suffering, anonymous victim of a harsh and unforgiving age. He was a fundamental, indispensable, utterly irreplaceable part of the great, unseen, often entirely unacknowledged engine that powered a civilization, that connected disparate, often hostile cultures, and that, in its own small, painful way, laid some of the crucial groundwork for the world that was to come. He wasn't just an insignificant drop in the vast, indifferent ocean of humanity. He and the thousands like him who toiled in similar obscurity were its very will to connect, to trade, to explore, to endure, and ultimately, to survive. His name is forgotten, his individual contributions are unrecorded, his profound and multifaceted suffering largely unimagined by those of us who came after, insulated by centuries of progress. But his collective legacy, the sum total of all that unthanked misery and effort, is eternal, etched into the very coastlines he so perilously navigated, embedded in the trade goods he so painfully carried, and alive in the enduring, often exasperating, human spirit of weary, wandering, yet somehow unyielding endurance that defines so much of our shared, often uncomfortable, historical story. He was, in every conceivable sense of the words, a true archetypal weary wanderer, and his long, arduous journey, for all its profound, undeniable, and comprehensively detailed suck factor, helped, in no small measure, to shape our world.